Hey dreamers, have you ever wondered what turns a simple wanderer into a legend? What invisible thread pulls an ordinary life toward an extraordinary destiny? And more importantly, what kind of world needs monsters so terrible that only a chosen few can stand against them? Tonight, we drift into a Greece that never quite existed in our history books. A Greece where twilight was thick with whispered prayers, where marble temples glowed like watchful guardians, and where the boundary between mortal and divine felt fragile as silk. A place where gods didn't just rule from above, they wandered through forests and city streets, leaving behind blessings, curses, and children who were never meant to live quiet lives. In this world, heroes weren't born shining and triumphant, they emerged slowly, shaped by fear, duty, longing, and that strange kind of courage that only appears when there's no turning back. And their greatness, oddly enough, wasn't defined by triumph, but by what they dared to confront. Because monsters in myths are rarely just teeth and claws, sometimes they are punishment, sometimes they are riddles made flesh, sometimes they are the echo of a god's anger given form and hunger. And the men who stood against them, their stories didn't shimmer in the moment. They grew with retelling around campfires, in palace halls, whispered by poets who understood that a hero isn't someone who wins, but someone who steps forward when every sensible instinct screams to run. Some names rise from that ancient hush with an almost otherworldly weight, not because they were perfect, but because they walked willingly into fear's open jaws. Heroes of different paths, different tempers, different tragedies, each marked by a single thread. The courage to face what the rest of the world prayed would pass them by. Among them were men who stalked beasts born from divine punishment, men who chased terror into the shadows, men who challenged monsters that should never have existed at all. Figures whispered by scholars, sung by poets, half remembered in fragments of crumbling stone, each carrying a story that asks, quietly, what a human spirit becomes when pressed against the edge of the impossible. And yes, we will meet Theseus on his winding roads, and we will look skyward with Bellerophon as he dares to rise beyond mortal limits. But they are only two voices in a vast, echoing chorus of myth. Countless others stand just beyond the torchlight, waiting their turn in this night's tale, each with their own monster lurking in the dark. They did not seek glory, at least not in the beginning. They sought meaning, identity, a place in a world where gods played games with mortal lives. And before we follow their footsteps into darkness, before the labyrinth tightens around us and wings beat against storm clouds, breathe for a moment. Let your mind settle into this world of half-light and ancient stone, where danger seldom roared, sometimes it simply waited, silent and patient, for a hero to arrive. Because every legend starts with a question, and somewhere in the hush between heartbeats, the story begins. Before we wander deeper into these ancient shadows, if you enjoy drifting through myth and mystery like this, you can tap the like button. It helps this story travel a little farther through the night. And if you're listening somewhere quiet, maybe getting ready to rest, let me know where you are. I love seeing where our dreamers tune in from. It began not with triumph, but with a secret, the kind that rests heavy on a mother's heart, waiting for the day her child grows strong enough to carry its weight. Imagine a quiet morning in Trojan, long before Athens knew the name of the boy who would one day define it. No trumpets, no omens in the sky, just a young man standing at the edge of his childhood, unaware that his life is about to shift like earth beneath a temple column. Aethra calls him to her side. Her voice isn't urgent, yet something in it makes Theseus still, as though the air itself has leaned closer to listen. There is something you must know, she whispers. And in that moment the world feels suddenly narrow, as though every path he could ever walk is tightening into a single line. She tells him of a king in faraway Athens, of a night touched by gods and fate, of a father who left no lullaby, only a promise and a test. Beneath a heavy stone, hidden all his life, lie a sword and sandals, waiting like sleeping truths. Theseus doesn't gasp, doesn't falter. Instead, he kneels, presses his palms to the cold rock, and begins to push. It doesn't move at first. Most would stop there, accept the comfort of the life they already have. But greatness rarely arrives in thunder. Sometimes it starts with the quiet refusal to give up. Stone shifts, dust rises, and when Theseus lifts the sword, There is no triumph, only understanding. If this story were gentle, his father would be waiting arms open. But Greek fate is never gentle. His path will not be safe, or soft, or paved with guidance. He must reach Athens alone, and the roads are the kind that swallow men whole. Others would take the sea, swift and protected. Theseus chooses the land, the wild, dangerous, haunted land, not because it is wise, but because deep within him something stirs, something that wants to face whatever the world hides in its darker corners. A boy no longer, a hero not yet. He steps forward, and somewhere, far ahead on a road lined with silent olive trees, the first monster waits, patient as hunger. He leaves at dawn. No farewells, no procession, just quiet footsteps on hard earth, a sword that still feels more like a question than a weapon, and a road that already tastes of danger. The path to Athens isn't travelled by those who value their lives. It winds through ravines where voices echo even when no one speaks, across lonely stretches where the only sound is the wind brushing dry grass like fingers searching for something lost. Travellers whisper about bandits, beasts, and things that do not belong to nature at all, but whispers don't stop Theseus. If anything, they steady him. By midday, the warmth of the sun hides the cold intention of the land, and that's when he meets the first one. An inn, small, unremarkable, almost inviting if you don't notice how still the air becomes the moment he approaches. No birds, no insects, even the breeze refuses to cross its threshold. A man stands at the door, smiling too warmly, like someone who knows the ending of a story you haven't begun to read yet. Procrustes. He beckons with gentle courtesy, promises rest, food, a bed that fits every traveller perfectly. His voice is honeyed, but beneath it lies metal, the kind sharpened by repetition, by habit, by cruelty dressed in hospitality. Theseus says nothing. He simply follows, quietly watching. The bed looks ordinary, too ordinary, but the iron tools near it glint like teeth beneath a polite smile. It's always the calm details that betray monsters, isn't it? Procrustes gestures toward the mattress with a flourish, waiting for trust to make its fatal mistake. It never comes. There is no grand speech, no heroic announcement. Theseus moves like instinct, fast, precise, inevitable. A struggle, brief and brutal, breaks the unnatural stillness of the room. And when it ends, the bed awaits its maker, and justice, in this world. He steps outside again, wiping his hands in the dirt as if brushing away a stranger's dream. No celebration, no relief, only the road, waiting. And ahead, deeper into the wild, hooves strike earth like thunder swallowed by distance. A boar, not an animal, but a punishment alive, heavy with rage and the memory of divine spite, prowls the hills of Crommyon. Theseus doesn't breathe excitement or fear. He simply walks, because once you choose a path like his, you don't hunt monsters for glory. You hunt them because turning back would mean pretending you never deserved the sword you carry. And the earth is already trembling. Athens does not greet Theseus with applause or prophecy. He arrives like a whisper carried on dusty roads. A stranger stepping through the city gates with nothing but a sword, a name, and a purpose he hasn't yet spoken aloud. Inside the palace, marble and torchlight feel colder than the wild paths behind him. King Aegeus looks at the young man before him and sees a truth he never dared to hope for. A son, blood of his blood, destiny finally come home. Joy flickers across his face, fragile and unsteady, like a candle in a draught. But where a king sees a son, others see a threat. The sons of Pallas watch from shadowed corners, hands resting a little too casually on their belts, eyes measuring the newcomer with the kind of attention reserved for enemies. A kingdom without an heir is a promise. A kingdom with one is a battlefield. Theseus wastes no breath on intrigue. The palace hums with quiet plotting, but he doesn't belong to rooms where power is whispered and traded. His fate lives outside, where danger breathes openly, and danger answers quickly. The Marathonian bull, a monster born from divine resentment, towering muscle and fury, tears through the countryside, a reminder that gods punish not just kings, but entire lands. Farmers flee, warriors hesitate, fear spreads like smoke. Theseus doesn't. He tracks the creature across wind-torn fields and broken olive groves, each footstep sinking into earth stained with panic. When the bull charges, the world seems to bend around its force. Hooves strike like thunder, and the ground trembles beneath ancient rage. But Theseus holds his ground. No speech, no flourish. Just a man meeting violence with resolve so quiet it feels like fate breathing. The struggle is brutal and brief. A collision of will and muscle and dust-choked air, and when the dust settles, Athens has its proof. The boy on the road is gone. He returns not triumphant, but steady. Aegeus sees strength. The people see hope. His rivals see a problem that can no longer be dismissed with whispers and wine-soaked schemes. And somewhere beyond those stone walls, beyond politics and pride, a darker summons stirs. Because victory over one bull was never the true trial. Across the sea, in the twisting heart of Crete, waits a secret older than Athens' stones, a curse buried in walls built to confuse the desperate, and a hunger that has never known mercy. Soon, Theseus will learn that monsters are not always found in the wild. Some wait in labyrinths, some are born from royalty, and one, in particular, waits in silence for him. The Minotaur. Now, here's where we have to discuss one of mythology's most deliciously complicated family trees. The story of the Minotaur begins with Pasiphae, the queen of Crete, wife of King Minos. Pasiphae had the extreme misfortune of catching the attention of Poseidon, who, in that particular style of divine seduction that was equal parts magic and violation, appeared to her in the form of a white bull. From this encounter, which was, again, never questioned in terms of its ethical implications, Pasiphae became pregnant with a creature that was neither fully human nor fully animal, but something grotesque and impossible, a man with the head of a bull. The child that was born was called the Minotaur, and it was an abomination in the most literal sense. It couldn't be killed without causing tremendous cosmic upheaval, and it couldn't be reasoned with or negotiated with in any meaningful way. It was essentially a problem for which there was no good solution, only terrible ones. So King Minos, faced with this monster born of his wife's indiscretion and a god's caprice, did what any desperate ruler would do. He built a prison. But not just any prison, this was the Labyrinth, a structure so convoluted and cunningly designed that once you entered, you could never escape. It was built by the legendary craftsman Daedalus, a man whose genius was matched only by his willingness to construct horrors on behalf of powerful kings. The labyrinth twisted and turned through underground passages, with dead ends and false paths at every corner. At its heart, in the deepest chamber, where no light penetrated, lived the Minotaur, a creature that needed to be fed, obviously, but feeding it required human sacrifice. And this is where the obligation comes in. Minos had previously been at war with Athens, and he had won. The price of his victory was that Athens would send tribute to Crete every 9 years, specifically 7 young men and 7 young women, all in the prime of their youth and strength. These tributes would be thrown into the labyrinth to be hunted and devoured by the Minotaur. It was a spectacle of horror dressed up as religious obligation, and it poisoned the relationship between the two cities with a kind of low-level, continuous horror. For years, Athens paid this price. Every 9 years, the lottery was held. Families wept. Young people said goodbye to their lives, knowing they would never return. The tributes were loaded onto ships and sent to Crete, where they would wander, lost in the labyrinth until the Minotaur found them. It was, Hera would have certainly approved, a punishment that never fully ended, that refreshed itself, that turned the city itself into a perpetual state of mourning. When Theseus came of age and understood the full weight of what his city was suffering, something stirred within him. This wasn't just a problem to be solved through strength or cleverness alone. This was a curse that needed to be broken. And he made a decision that stunned his father and the Council of Athens alike. He volunteered to be part of the next tribute. He would go to Crete himself, walk into the labyrinth, and face the Minotaur. He would either return victorious, or he would die like all the others. The prospect was so audacious, so completely reckless, that it took courage simply to speak the words aloud. But Theseus was determined. He was no longer just a young man proving himself he was a hero, choosing to walk into darkness not for personal glory, but for the salvation of his people. When the ships arrived in Crete bearing the tribute, including Theseus, They were received by King Minos with the usual formal coldness of a man presiding over an obligatory ritual. But something unexpected happened. The king's daughter, Ariadne, saw Theseus among the tributes, and she was struck by something in him, whether it was his bearing, his courage, or simply the kind of divine intervention that mythology loved to sprinkle into romantic moments. Ariadne knew the secret of the labyrinth in a way that no outsider could. She understood its design, its paths, its hidden logic. More importantly, she loved her father's kingdom, but she was also horrified by what the labyrinth represented. The creature at its heart was an abomination that should never have been brought into being. The tributes the innocent young people sent to their deaths deserved better. And when she spoke with Theseus before he entered the labyrinth, she made him an offer. She would give him a ball of thread, a simple thing really, just cord wound tightly. But this was no ordinary thread. She instructed him to tie one end at the entrance to the labyrinth before he went inside. Then, as he wandered through its twisting passages and descended into its depths, he would unwind the thread, letting it trail behind him. When he encountered the Minotaur and, if the gods were with him, defeated it, he could follow the thread back the way he came, retracing his path through the impossible maze that would have otherwise trapped him forever. It was an elegant solution, really, and it demonstrated something important about Theseus's nature. He wasn't a hero who succeeded through strength alone. He was someone who understood that intelligence, preparation, and the kindness of others could be just as valuable as physical prowess. He accepted Ariadne's help and her love, though he was aware that accepting both meant leaving her with empty promises once he returned to Athens. That's a rather complicated emotional note for our hero to carry, isn't it? The night before he was to enter the labyrinth, Theseus barely slept. He lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of Crete around him, aware that dawn would bring him face to face with a creature that existed in the nightmares of an entire region. The Minotaur was legend, made flesh part human intelligence, part bestial hunger. It had lived in the darkness of that labyrinth for years, hunting tributes, growing stronger with each kill, perhaps growing lonelier with each passing year as it remained imprisoned in its stone maze. When morning came, Theseus was led to the entrance of the labyrinth. The structure rose before him like a wound in the earth, a massive stone complex with passages that seemed to swallow light itself. He tied the thread at the entrance, just as Ariadne had instructed, and then he stepped inside. The darkness was absolute. His eyes took time to adjust, and even when they did, he could make out only faint shapes and shadows. The air was cool and stale, untouched by sunlight. The stone beneath his feet was smooth from the passage of many feet, the feet of those who had walked these passages before him, most of whom had not walked out again. He moved forward slowly, methodically, paying careful attention to the turns and the passages, letting the thread slip through his fingers as he went. The labyrinth was indeed as intricate as he had been told. At every intersection there were multiple paths. Some seemed to lead deeper into the earth, others seemed to circle back on themselves. Without the thread, without Ariadne's guidance, a person could wander for days and never find their way out. As Theseus ventured deeper, the air changed. It became warmer, thicker, suffused with a scent that was distinctly alive. Sweat and blood and something else, something alien. He was getting close. He could feel it in the way the shadows seemed to move with intention. The Minotaur was hunting, or perhaps it had caught his scent and was curious about this new tribute that smelled different from the others. Then he heard it. A sound that was part roar, part bellow, a vocalization that no human throat could produce. The Minotaur was calling out, announcing its presence, perhaps calling a challenge to this intruder in its domain. Theseus drew his sword, a weapon that was both a comfort and almost certainly useless against a creature of this magnitude. What would steel do against something that was half divine, half monstrous, born of a god's rage and a queen's terrible transformation? But Theseus had courage, and he had something else. He had the fury of a man who was tired of his city being tormented. He had the determination of someone who had already decided that walking into the darkness of the labyrinth meant accepting that he might never walk out. And he had the love of a woman who had shown him the path to victory. He moved forward into the deepest chambers of the maze. The confrontation that followed wasn't described in simple terms by the ancient poets. What we know is that Theseus entered the heart of the labyrinth and confronted the Minotaur. What we know is that steel was matched against muscle, intelligence against instinct, and somehow, against all odds, Theseus emerged victorious. The monster that had terrorized an entire region was dead. But the victory would have meant nothing if Theseus couldn't escape. He turned to the thread, retracing his path through the dark passages with desperate urgency. Behind him he could imagine the monster's blood seeping into the stone, the creature's life draining into the darkness. Behind him was the weight of what he had accomplished, but ahead of him was the only thing that mattered: escape. When he emerged from the labyrinth into daylight, it was like being born into a new world. The thread had held. Ariadne was waiting for him, and together they fled Crete under cover of darkness. The king's daughter had chosen love over duty, revolution over the established order. She had sided with the hero who had walked into the darkness and returned. But this is where we pause our story, because Theseus's greatest victory had been achieved. The Minotaur was dead. The labyrinth had released him. The curse that had hung over Athens for so many years was finally broken. The tributes would no longer have to be sent. The young people of Athens would no longer have to wonder if the lottery might call their names. Now, you might be wondering at this point which monster slayer you find yourself most drawn to in these early stories. Honestly, which aspect of Theseus's journey speaks most to you? For me, it has to be the moment when he accepts Ariadne's help with the thread. There's something deeply compelling about a hero who understands that victory isn't always about strength alone, but about accepting the love and support of others. It's a lesson that transcends mythology. But Theseus wasn't the only hero who achieved impossible feats against impossible creatures. There was another, a man whose name would become synonymous with one of the most visually spectacular achievements in all of mythology. A man who, unlike Theseus, didn't rely on cunning or the help of lovers, but who achieved something that required him to literally rise above the earthly realm. His name was Bellerophon. Now, Bellerophon's story begins in a different part of the Greek world, in different circumstances, with different challenges entirely. Where Theseus was born into a kind of divine ambiguity, uncertain of his true father until adolescence, Bellerophon was born fully mortal, the son of Poseidon according to some accounts, or Glaucus according to others. The details of his parentage were less important than the circumstances of his early life. Bellerophon was born in Corinth, and from his earliest days he was marked by a kind of restlessness, a hunger for achievement that never seemed to be quite satisfied. The young Bellerophon was a man of extraordinary physical gifts. He was strong, quick, intelligent, and possessed a kind of natural charisma that drew people to him. But he was also, in the way of many gifted young men, somewhat reckless. He made enemies easily, sometimes through no obvious fault of his own, and sometimes through his own poor judgment. At one point in his youth, he killed a man. The circumstances varied depending on which version of the story you consulted, but the result was the same. He became a murderer, and regardless of the justifications, that label followed him. Seeking to escape his past and the obligations that blood feuds entailed, Bellerophon fled to the court of King Proetus in Tiryns. The king received him, as kings often did with young nobles fleeing their troubles. But there was a woman at court, Antea, the wife of Proetus, a woman of extraordinary beauty and equally extraordinary venality. She took one look at Bellerophon and decided that she wanted him. When Bellerophon refused her advances, maintaining either his honor or his good sense, depending on how generous one wanted to be about his motivations, Antaea did what scorned women have always done in mythology. She lied. She accused Bellerophon of the very advances she had made on him, spinning a tale of attempted seduction and betrayal. She was so convincing, so believable, that King Proetus fell into a terrible fury. But here was the complexity of ancient honor codes. Killing Bellerophon directly would violate the laws of hospitality, since Bellerophon was his guest. So instead, Proetus sent Bellerophon away with a sealed letter to Iobates, the king of a distant land called Lycia. The letter, written in a kind of divine or magical script that only the king of Lycia could read, contained a simple request. He asked Iobates to kill the bearer of the letter. Bellerophon travelled to Lycia unaware that he was carrying his own death warrant. When he arrived at the court of Iobates, the king received him with courtesy and kindness. But then he read the letter. Now, here's where the story becomes interesting, because instead of simply executing Bellerophon outright, King Iobates decided to set him an impossible task, something that would accomplish the king's request while maintaining the appearance of fairness. He told Bellerophon that the kingdom of Lycia was being terrorized by a terrible creature. If Bellerophon could defeat this creature, then his honor would be restored, and the king could in good conscience refuse to honor Proetus's request. It was, in essence, a test that Iobates didn't really expect anyone to pass. The creature in question was the Chimera. The Chimera was like something dreamed up by someone who had taken all of their worst fears and combined them into a single form. It was a creature born from the depths of chaos, part lion in its front, part goat rising from its back, and part serpent as its tail. It breathed fire. It was cunning and cruel. It had terrorized the countryside for years, and no warrior had managed to defeat it. Many had tried. All had failed. Most had died horribly in the attempt. When Bellerophon was told of the Chimera, he felt the weight of the impossible task settle on his shoulders. He could attempt it and almost certainly die, or he could refuse and be executed for refusing an order from his king. It was a test designed to eliminate him, but it was also a test that offered him, at least theoretically, a path to salvation. So he accepted. But Bellerophon was no fool. He wasn't going to simply march out into the wilderness and hope to encounter the Chimera in single combat. He understood that facing a creature of pure fire and claws in a straightforward battle would be suicide. He needed an advantage. He needed something that would allow him to fight the creature on his own terms, rather than on terms dictated by its nature. This is where divine intervention entered the story, as it so often did. As Bellerophon was preparing his weapons and making his plans, a goddess appeared to him, Athena herself, the embodiment of wisdom and strategic warfare. She didn't offer him strength or magical weapons. Instead, she offered him something far more valuable. She revealed to him where he could find Pegasus. Pegasus was a creature that existed in the liminal space between the natural and the divine. It was a horse, certainly, but a horse born from the blood of Medusa after her death, and thus imbued with divine magic. It had wings, magnificent, powerful wings capable of carrying it through the sky, rising above the earth and the limitations of the ground. Pegasus was wild and uncaptured, roaming the mountainous regions of Greece, and the very idea of catching such a creature seemed as impossible as defeating the Chimera itself. But Athena provided Bellerophon with a magical bridle, a piece of divine craftsmanship that would allow him to tame the wild horse. Bellerophon set out into the mountains to hunt for Pegasus, and whether through luck, divine guidance, or the inexorable logic of mythology, he found the creature. Pegasus was drinking from a spring near the palace of Corinth when Bellerophon, moving with extreme caution and carrying the divine bridle hidden behind his back, approached. Now, here's a moment that deserves reflection. Pegasus was a wild creature, fierce, powerful, potentially dangerous. Yet this creature, who had never been ridden by anyone, who had existed in perfect freedom high above the world, allowed itself to be bridled by Bellerophon. Some accounts say that Pegasus recognized something in the hero, some quality of worthiness or heroic potential. Others suggest that the magic of Athena's bridle was simply irresistible. Whatever the reason, Bellerophon found himself perched upon the back of the winged horse, and from that moment forward, the nature of his quest changed entirely. With Pegasus beneath him, Bellerophon had transcended the limitations of earthbound heroes. He could now rise above the world, see things from a perspective that few humans had ever experienced. The sky opened up beneath him, and he could move with a kind of freedom that separated him from the ordinary constraints of mortality. It was, in its way, a form of apotheosis, not becoming a god exactly, but approaching the divine realm in a way that few mortals were ever privileged to do. When Bellerophon finally located the chimera, it was wreaking its usual havoc in the countryside, burning villages, terrorizing livestock, hunting humans. The creature was magnificent in its monstrosity, all muscle and fire and barely contained rage. When it saw Bellerophon approaching on his winged horse, descending from the sky itself, the chimera must have experienced something unfamiliar. For the first time, a challenger was arriving on terms that weren't established by the creature's own dominance of the ground. The battle between Bellerophon and the chimera was everything you'd expect when a man on a flying horse confronts a fire-breathing abomination, spectacular, terrifying, and ultimately decisive. But even as Bellerophon proved that heroism could take flight, literally ascending above the limitations of earthbound combat, there was another hero whose legend would eclipse even his. A hero whose name has echoed through the millennia with such force that every generation since has known it. A hero who didn't face one monster, or two, or even a dozen scattered challenges, but who was systematically assigned a gauntlet of impossible tasks specifically designed to kill him. His name, depending on whether you're speaking Greek or Latin, was Heracles or Hercules. And if Theseus was the specialist and Bellerophon was the audacious, then Hercules was the inevitable. A force of nature wrapped in human flesh, cursed and blessed in equal measure, whose very existence seemed to offend the natural order. Now, before we dive into the monsters themselves, and we will dive deep into those gloriously horrifying creatures, we need to understand something crucial about Hercules. His story isn't one of a hero who chose glory. It's the story of a man who was forced into redemption, who had to literally fight his way back from the depths of unforgivable tragedy. Because Hercules, for all his strength and all his divine parentage, committed an act so terrible that it required penance on a cosmic scale. Let's go back to the beginning, to the circumstances that would shape everything that followed. Hercules was born from one of Zeus's many extramarital affairs, this time with a mortal woman named Alcmene. Zeus, being Zeus, had disguised himself as Alcmene's husband to seduce her, which was, as these things go in Greek mythology, just another Tuesday in the divine soap opera. But Hera, Zeus's wife, was not amused. She never was. And unlike mortals who might rage for a season and then move on, Hera was immortal, which meant her anger had the benefit of eternity to mature and ferment into something truly magnificent in its vindictiveness. Hera tried to kill Hercules when he was still an infant, sending 2 serpents into his crib to strangle him, but even as a baby, Hercules possessed strength that defied reason. He strangled both serpents with his bare hands, treating divine assassination attempts as though they were particularly aggressive toys. It was a preview of what was to come, a demonstration that this child was something unprecedented, something that existed in that dangerous space between mortal and divine. Hercules grew into manhood with strength that seemed to increase with each passing year. He married Megara, the daughter of the king of Thebes, and together they had children, a family, a life, something approaching normalcy for a man who was anything but normal. And perhaps that's what Hera couldn't stand. Perhaps the idea that Hercules might actually find peace. might actually escape the curse of his parentage and live a quiet, happy life was more than she could tolerate. So she struck. Not with serpents this time, not with monsters or divine warriors. She struck at Hercules' mind itself. Hera induced in him a madness so complete, so absolute, that Hercules couldn't distinguish reality from nightmare. And in that madness, believing he was fighting enemies, believing he was protecting his home, Hercules killed his own wife and children. When the madness lifted, when reality reasserted itself and Hercules saw what he had done, he was confronted with a horror that no amount of strength could undo. His family was dead by his own hands. The blood was his. The guilt was infinite and inescapable. It's the kind of tragedy that would have destroyed most men, sending them into madness permanently or driving them to take their own lives. But Hercules did something different. He sought atonement. He travelled to Delphi, to the oracle who dwelled in Apollo's temple, and spoke truths that were often cruel but never false. He asked what he must do to cleanse himself of this crime, how he could possibly atone for the unforgivable. And the oracle gave him an answer that must have felt like a second death. He was to go to Tiryns and place himself in service to King Eurystheus of Mycenae for 10 years. He would become a servant to a man he knew to be far inferior to himself in every measure. He would submit to whatever tasks this king demanded, and if he succeeded, if he survived, he would not only atone for his crimes, but be rewarded with immortality itself. Now, here's where the tragedy becomes almost unbearable in its irony. King Eurystheus was Hercules' cousin, and he was exactly the kind of petty, fearful man who would receive this gift of power over a demigod and immediately weaponize it. Working under Hera's influence, because of course she wasn't going to miss this opportunity, Eurystheus devised a series of tasks specifically calculated to be impossible. These weren't just difficult challenges. These were labors designed to kill. Each one was a death sentence dressed up as an assignment, and Hercules, bound by his oath to the oracle and desperate to atone for his crimes, accepted them all. The labours eventually would number 12. Originally there were 10, but Eurystheus, in that petty way of small men given power over great ones, refused to count 2 of them, claiming Hercules had received help for one and had accepted payment for another, as though the terms of impossible servitude required him to suffer alone and unpaid. So 2 more were added, extending the torment, stretching the penance until it encompassed years of Hercules' life. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning, with the first labour, the one that would establish the pattern for everything that followed. Because when Eurystheus commanded Hercules to go to Nemea and slay the lion that dwelled there, he was sending him to confront something that shouldn't exist, something that represented the breakdown of natural law itself. The Nemean lion was no ordinary beast. Yes, it was a lion. It had the basic form and the killing instinct of the great cats. But it had been born from divine chaos, possibly the offspring of the monsters Typhon and Echidna, which meant its lineage was pure, concentrated horror. The creature was massive, far larger than any natural lion, and it possessed a hide that was completely, utterly impervious to weapons. Swords shattered against it, arrows bounced off as though striking stone, spears might as well have been children's toys. The lion had been terrorizing the region of Nemea for years, killing livestock, slaughtering anyone who dared to hunt it, establishing a reign of terror that seemed impossible to end because the creature simply could not be harmed by conventional means. When Hercules arrived in Nemea, he found a region paralyzed by fear. The people had long since stopped trying to kill the beast. They simply avoided it, retreated when it was near, and mourned when it inevitably claimed another victim. Hercules studied the problem with the kind of intelligence that his massive physical strength sometimes obscured. He understood immediately that his weapons would be useless. The creature's invulnerability wasn't a challenge to be overcome with better swords or sharper arrows. It was an absolute negation of those tools. So he did something that seems obvious in retrospect, but required tremendous courage in practice. He decided to fight the lion with his bare hands. Hercules tracked the Nemean Lion to its lair, a cave with 2 entrances, which meant the creature could always escape if threatened from one direction. Hercules, demonstrating the intelligence that complemented his strength, blocked one entrance with boulders, sealing off the lion's escape route. Then he entered through the other opening, descending into the darkness where the beast waited. What happened next is the stuff of legend, though the ancient poets were somewhat vague on the specifics, perhaps because the specifics were too brutal, too visceral for comfortable storytelling. Hercules confronted the lion in the darkness of its cave. The beast, recognizing a threat, attacked with all the fury and power of its unnatural strength, and Hercules met it not with weapons but with his own body, his own impossible strength. The struggle was primal. There was no technique here, no martial artistry, just raw power against raw power, muscle against muscle. Hercules grappled with the lion, wrestling it in the confined space of the cave, feeling its claws rake across his skin, feeling its breath hot against his face. And then, in a moment that defined everything about what made Hercules unique among heroes, he wrapped his arms around the lion's neck and squeezed. He strangled it. He choked the life out of a creature that was supposed to be unkillable, using nothing but the strength of his arms and the determination of a man who had murdered his own family and could not afford to fail. When the lion finally went still, when its massive body relaxed in death, Hercules had achieved something that no other warrior in Greece had managed. He had killed the unkillable. But he wasn't finished. The lion's hide, that impervious skin that had protected it in life, was precisely what Hercules needed. He tried to skin the creature with his knife and found, unsurprisingly, that the hide was just as impervious in death as it had been in life, so he used the only tool that could cut through it, the lion's own claws. He fashioned the hide into a cloak that he would wear for the rest of his life, a trophy that announced to everyone who saw him that he had strangled a divine beast with his bare hands. When Hercules returned to King Eurystheus with the lion's body, or in some versions wearing its skin, the king was terrified. He had sent Hercules on this labor fully expecting him to die, and instead he had returned victorious, wearing the proof of his impossible achievement. Eurystheus was so frightened that he had a large bronze jar partially buried in the earth so he could hide in it whenever Hercules returned with proof of his labors. It's a delicious image, isn't it? The king cowering in his hiding jar while the hero he'd tried to kill stood above, dripping with the blood of monsters. But Eurystheus wasn't finished. The first labor had failed to kill Hercules, which meant it was time for the second. And this time, the king would send him to confront something even more terrible than an invulnerable lion. He would send him to face a creature that could literally multiply its threat with each injury inflicted upon it. A monster whose very biology was designed to punish those who dared to fight it. He would send Hercules to kill the Hydra. The Lernaean Hydra was everything a nightmare should be, serpentine, venomous, and fundamentally wrong in the way that only creatures born from divine malice can be. It lived in the swamps near Lerna, in the Argolid, where the water was dark and still, and the air itself seemed poisoned by the creature's presence. The Hydra had the body of a massive serpent, but where most snakes have one head, the Hydra had many sources vary on the exact number, with some claiming 7, others 9, and still others suggesting as many as 100 writhing, hissing heads, each one capable of killing with a single bite. But here's what made the Hydra truly monstrous, what elevated it from merely dangerous to genuinely apocalyptic. Every time someone managed to cut off one of its heads, 2 more would grow in its place. It was a creature that became more deadly the more you fought it, that punished aggression by multiplying its threat. You could spend hours hacking away at it, reducing it to a writhing stump, and end up facing twice as many fangs as when you started. It was a biological impossibility, designed to demonstrate the futility of violence, the kind of monster that made experienced warriors simply walk away. And if that weren't enough, because apparently the ancient Greeks believed in really committing to their monster designs, one of the Hydra's heads was immortal. Completely, genuinely unkillable. Even if you somehow managed to stop the regeneration, even if you found a way to permanently remove the mortal heads, that one immortal head would remain, snapping and killing and refusing to die because that was its fundamental nature. When Hercules arrived at the swamps of Lerna for his second labor, he understood immediately that this wasn't a problem that could be solved with brute strength alone. The Nemean Lion had required power, yes, but the Hydra required strategy. It required thinking several moves ahead, understanding the nature of the threat and adapting to it. So Hercules brought with him his nephew Iolaus, who was young but capable, someone who could assist without being a liability. Finding the Hydra wasn't difficult. The creature was territorial and had no reason to hide. Hercules tracked it to its lair, a cave near the springs of Lerna, where the darkness seemed almost solid and the smell of venom hung heavy in the air. But the Hydra, perhaps sensing that this was no ordinary visitor, refused to emerge. It remained in its cave, coiled in the shadows, hissing warnings that echoed in the enclosed space. So Hercules forced the issue. He lit arrows on fire and shot them into the cave, filling it with smoke and flame, making the darkness uninhabitable even for a creature that called it home. The Hydra, driven out by the heat and the choking smoke, emerged into the open, and Hercules got his first good look at the monster that was supposed to kill him. It was massive, far larger than any natural serpent, with heads that moved independently, each one tracking Hercules with predatory intelligence. The creature's breath was said to be so toxic that it could kill a man who simply stood too close, and its blood was pure venom, so poisonous that even touching it meant death. This wasn't just a monster to be fought, this was a biological hazard, a walking apocalypse. Hercules attacked with his sword, striking at the nearest head and severing it with a single powerful blow. And immediately, catastrophically, 2 new heads sprouted from the wound, growing at impossible speed, fully formed and ready to kill within seconds. He struck again, cutting off another head, and watched as 2 more replaced it. The Hydra was growing, becoming more dangerous with each attack, and Hercules realized, with the kind of cold clarity that separates heroes from corpses, that this approach would only get him killed. This is where Iolaus proved his worth. Hercules, thinking quickly, called to his nephew with new instructions. Each time Hercules severed a head, Iolaus would immediately cauterize the wound with a burning torch, sealing the stump before new heads could grow. It was a solution that required perfect coordination. Hercules had to strike quickly enough to keep the Hydra off balance, and Iolaus had to seal each wound before the regeneration could begin. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the Hydra would multiply beyond any hope of control. They worked in tandem, Hercules cutting and Iolaus burning, moving around the creature in a deadly dance. The Hydra thrashed and struck, its remaining heads attacking from every angle, its venom spraying across the ground where it hissed and bubbled. And just to make the situation even more impossible, because apparently the Hydra needed backup, Hera sent a giant crab to attack Hercules from behind, trying to distract him, trying to create the opening that would let the Hydra deliver a killing strike. Hercules crushed the crab beneath his foot without even turning around, maintaining his focus on the Hydra, never breaking the rhythm of his attacks. One by one, the mortal heads were severed and cauterized, reduced to sealed stumps that could no longer regenerate, until finally only one head remained, the immortal one, the head that could not be killed. Hercules did the only thing that made sense when confronted with something that refused to die. He buried it. He severed the immortal head with a golden sword, and then, because the head was still alive and still snapping and still trying to kill him, he buried it under an enormous boulder at the side of the road, trapping it there for eternity. It's probably still there, if you believe the myths. Somewhere beneath the earth near Lerna, there's an immortal serpent head pinned under a rock, forever alive, forever angry, forever unable to die or escape. It's the kind of solution that's simultaneously practical and deeply unsettling. But Hercules wasn't finished. The Hydra's blood, that impossibly toxic venom that could kill with the slightest touch, was too valuable to waste. Hercules dipped his arrows in the creature's blood, coating them with poison so potent that even the smallest wound would be fatal. These arrows would become one of his signature weapons, a legacy of this labor that would follow him through the rest of his adventures. They would also, eventually, be the instrument of his own demise, because Greek mythology loves nothing more than a perfectly cruel irony. When Hercules returned to King Eurystheus with news of his victory, the king's reaction was predictable. He refused to count the labor as completed, claiming that Hercules had received help from Iolaus and therefore hadn't accomplished the task alone. It was a technicality, the kind of petty complaint that only makes sense when you're a small man trying to maintain control over someone vastly greater. But Hercules had no choice. He was bound by his oath, and if Eurystheus said the labor didn't count, then the labor didn't count. The penance would continue. The third labor took Hercules north, to the mountains of Cerenea in Arcadia, to hunt a creature that was, for once, not actively trying to kill everything around it. The Cerenean hind was a deer, a massive, beautiful creature with golden antlers and hooves of bronze, sacred to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. Eurystheus commanded Hercules to capture it alive and bring it back to Mycenae, which sounds simple until you consider that this particular deer could outrun arrows and had been running wild for years, evading every hunter who'd tried to claim it. This labor wasn't about strength or combat. This was about patience, persistence, and the kind of endurance that most heroes lacked. Hercules tracked the hind for a full year, following it across mountains and valleys, through forests and over rivers, never quite close enough to capture it, but never falling so far behind that he lost the trail. It was a different kind of challenge, one that tested not his power but his determination, his ability to commit to a goal even when progress seemed impossibly slow. Finally, after a year of pursuit, the hind stopped to drink at a river, exhausted, unable to run any further. Hercules seized his opportunity. Some versions say he captured it with his bare hands, others claim he shot it with an arrow carefully aimed to wound but not kill, pinning it in place so he could bind it. Either way, he succeeded in capturing the sacred deer and began the journey back to Mycenae. This is where things got complicated, because Artemis, understandably upset that someone had captured her sacred animal, confronted Hercules on the road. Imagine that conversation. Hercules, carrying a golden deer, faced with an angry goddess demanding to know why he dared to touch something that belonged to her. But Hercules explained his situation, his penance, his servitude to Eurystheus, and apparently his sincerity was convincing enough that Artemis agreed to let him continue, provided he released the hind after showing it to the king. Hercules did exactly that. He brought the creature to Eurystheus, proved he'd completed the task, and then released it to run back to the wilderness and Artemis. The fourth labor sent Hercules back to the mountains, this time to the slopes of Mount Erymanthos, to capture another beast alive, the Erymanthian boar. Now, if you're thinking that a boar sounds less threatening than a hydra or a lion with impervious skin, you've clearly never encountered an angry wild boar. These creatures are living tanks of muscle and fury, with tusks that can gore a man open and a temperament that makes them attack first and never ask questions. The Erymanthian boar was particularly massive, particularly aggressive, and had been terrorizing the countryside around Mount Erymanthos for years. Hercules' task was to capture it alive and bring it back to Eurystheus, which meant he couldn't simply kill it with his poisoned arrows or strangle it like the Nemean Lion. He had to outsmart it. Hercules tracked the boar to its territory and then used the environment itself as a weapon. He drove the boar up the mountain, chasing it higher and higher until they reached the snow-covered upper slopes where the drifts were deep and movement became difficult. The boar, exhausted and slowed by the deep snow, finally became vulnerable. Hercules trapped it in a snowdrift, bound it with chains, and then, in what must have been an absolutely absurd sight, carried the massive, furious creature down the mountain on his shoulders. When he arrived at Mycenae with the living, thrashing boar, Eurystheus was so terrified that he hid in his bronze jar and refused to come out until Hercules had removed the creature from the palace. It's worth pausing to appreciate this image, the king of Mycenae, cowering in a buried jar, while Hercules stood outside holding a giant angry pig, probably wondering if all these labours were worth immortality. The fifth labour took Hercules to one of the most disgusting, degrading, and oddly brilliant challenges he would face. King Augeas of Elis owned vast herds of cattle. Some sources claim thousands of animals. Others say it was closer to 3,000, but the exact number matters less than the result of keeping that many cattle in one place. The stables where these cattle were kept hadn't been cleaned in 30 years. 30 years of cattle waste, piled higher than a man could stand, spread across acres of land, creating a biological disaster that made the area uninhabitable and probably visible from miles away based on the smell alone. Eurystheus commanded Hercules to clean these stables in a single day. It was an impossible task, made more degrading by its nature. This wasn't combat, wasn't monster slaying, wasn't anything that would be sung about by poets. This was manual labour of the most unpleasant kind, designed to humiliate as much as to challenge. But Hercules, once again demonstrating that his intelligence matched his strength, refused to accept the task on Eurystheus's terms. Instead of shoveling manure for the rest of his life, he examined the geography of the area and noticed that 2 rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, flowed nearby. Hercules cut channels in the stable walls and diverted both rivers directly through the stables, creating a massive flood that washed away 30 years of accumulated waste in a matter of hours. It was brilliant, an engineering solution to what appeared to be a brute force problem. The stables were cleaned in a single day, exactly as required, without Hercules having to personally shovel a single cow pie. But when Hercules returned to Eurystheus, the king once again refused to count the labour, claiming that Hercules had been paid by King Augeas for the work and therefore it didn't qualify as part of his penance. Another technicality, another labour that wouldn't count, another extension of Hercules' servitude. The sixth labour sent Hercules to deal with a problem that was less about individual combat and more about ecological nightmare. The Stymphalian birds were not your average nuisance wildlife. These were creatures that had gathered in vast numbers around Lake Stymphalia in Arcadia, and they had transformed a once peaceful region into something out of a horror story. These birds had beaks of bronze and metallic feathers that they could launch like arrows, turning them into flying weapons capable of killing from a distance. They also had a taste for human flesh, which is always an unfortunate dietary preference in any species. The birds had multiplied to such numbers that they blocked out the sun when they flew, and their droppings, because apparently every labour needed at least one deeply unpleasant detail, were toxic, poisoning the land and making it uninhabitable. The sheer number of birds made traditional hunting impossible. You couldn't simply walk in and start shooting arrows at them. There were too many, they were too dangerous, and they could attack from above in coordinated swarms. Hercules stood at the edge of the lake, surveying the problem, and realized he was facing a challenge that couldn't be solved through strength alone. This required a different approach entirely, and once again divine intervention arrived in the form of Athena, who provided him with a pair of bronze castanets, or in some versions, a rattle crafted by Hephaestus himself. These instruments, when clashed together, produced a noise so loud, so jarring, that it would drive the birds into the air in panic. Hercules climbed to a high point near the lake and began to shake the castanets, creating a cacophony that echoed across the water and through the surrounding hills. The noise was unbearable, a divine dissonance that sent the Stymphalian birds into terrified flight. They rose from their roosting places in enormous dark clouds, filling the sky, and as they flew overhead, Hercules shot them down with his poisoned arrows, the same arrows he dipped in the Hydra's blood during his second labor. Those birds he couldn't kill, he drove away permanently, sending them fleeing to the island of Odysseus in the Black Sea, where they would no longer terrorize human settlements. It was a labor that demonstrated something important about Hercules that sometimes gets lost in all the tales of his strength. He was adaptable. He understood when to use force and when to use strategy, when to rely on his muscles and when to accept help from the gods. The seventh labor brought Hercules back to a creature he'd already encountered once before, the Cretan bull. This was the same magnificent, terrifying beast that had been sent by Poseidon, the same bull that had driven Queen Pasiphae of Crete into her infamous passion, the same bull whose union with the queen had produced the Minotaur. After serving its purpose in that particular divine drama, the bull had been allowed to roam free on Crete, where it had been causing havoc, destroying crops, attacking people, generally behaving like an angry god made flesh, which it essentially was. King Minos of Crete was happy to have Hercules deal with the problem, and Hercules, for his part, approached the task with the confidence of someone who had already captured one deadly boar alive and knew the principles involved. He tracked the bull across Crete, cornered it, and then, in a display of strength that must have been genuinely awe-inspiring to witness, wrestled it into submission with his bare hands. He bound it, carried it back across the sea to Mycenae, and presented it to Eurystheus, who took one look at the massive, divine, clearly dangerous bull and immediately told Hercules to get rid of it. Hercules released the bull, which then wandered across Greece until it eventually made its way to Marathon, where it would later be recaptured by Theseus in that hero's own cycle of monster slaying. It's a nice bit of narrative symmetry, really. One hero's labor becoming another hero's challenge, the monsters and tasks cycling through the generations like particularly violent heirlooms. The eighth labor took Hercules north to Thrace, to the territory of King Diomedes, who kept a stable of mares that were, in typical Greek mythological fashion, not normal horses. These were the mares of Diomedes, and they were man-eaters, literally. Diomedes fed his horses a diet of human flesh, specifically the flesh of strangers who had the misfortune of accepting his hospitality, which must have made dinner invitations in that kingdom somewhat anxiety-inducing. Hercules arrived in Thrace with a group of companions and immediately went about stealing the mares, which proved easier than expected. The challenge came when Diomedes and his men discovered the theft and attacked. In the battle that followed, Hercules' young companion Abderus was killed, dragged away and devoured by the very horses they were trying to steal, which is exactly the kind of tragic irony that Greek mythology specialized in. Hercules, enraged by the death of his friend, defeated Diomedes and his men in combat. And then, in what might be the most grimly appropriate solution in all the labors, he fed Diomedes himself to the man-eating mares. Once the horses had consumed their former master, once they had been fed, the man who had twisted them into monsters, they became calm, tamed by the completion of that particular cycle of violence. Hercules brought them back to Eurystheus, who dedicated them to Hera. According to some traditions, these horses eventually produced descendants that lived for centuries, as if the violence that created them had made them somehow immortal. The ninth labor sent Hercules after something that seemed, at first, less deadly than the previous challenges. He was commanded to retrieve the belt of Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. Now, the Amazons were a tribe of warrior women who lived beyond the borders of the Greek world, fierce fighters who had organized their society without men, who trained from childhood in the arts of war, and who were, by all accounts, not particularly interested in visitors who came demanding their sacred artifacts. The belt itself was a gift from Ares, the god of war, and it symbolized Hippolyta's authority over her people. Eurystheus claimed he wanted it for his daughter, though the real purpose was almost certainly to send Hercules into a confrontation that would get him killed by an army of trained warriors. Hercules sailed to the land of the Amazons with a company of heroes, expecting battle. But when he arrived and explained his mission to Hippolyta, something unexpected happened. She agreed to give him the belt willingly. She was impressed by his reputation, perhaps curious about this hero who had accomplished so many impossible tasks, and she saw no reason to fight over an object when diplomacy would suffice. But Hera, watching from Olympus and seeing that Hercules was about to complete his labor without suffering, couldn't allow it. She disguised herself as an Amazon warrior and spread a rumor through the camp that Hercules was planning to kidnap their queen. The Amazons, believing their leader was in danger, attacked. Hercules, thinking he'd been betrayed, fought back. In the chaos of battle, Hippolyta was killed. Accounts vary on whether Hercules killed her directly or whether she died in the fighting, and Hercules took the belt from her body. It's one of the more tragic labors because it began with the possibility of peace, with a queen willing to help and a hero grateful to avoid bloodshed. But divine interference, jealousy, and miscommunication turned it into violence and death. Hercules returned to Mycenae with the belt, having completed the labor but having lost something else in the process. Another piece of his humanity, another reminder that his strength could destroy even when he didn't intend it to. The 10th labor sent Hercules to the edge of the known world. He was commanded to steal the cattle of Geryon, a monster who lived on the island of Erythea in the far west, beyond the pillars that marked the end of the Mediterranean, the pillars that would later be called the Pillars of Hercules. Geryon was a giant with 3 bodies, 3 heads, and 6 arms, guarded by Orthrus, a 2-headed dog who was the brother of Cerberus, and a herdsman named Eurytion. To reach Erythea, Hercules had to cross through territories and face challenges that took him months, perhaps years. He travelled through Libya and encountered such heat that he shot an arrow at the sun itself in frustration, an act of such audacious arrogance that Helios, the sun god, was apparently charmed by it, and lent Hercules a golden cup that could sail across the ocean. Hercules used this golden cup to reach the island, and when he arrived he made short work of Geryon's guardians. Orthrus attacked and was killed with a single blow from Hercules' club. Eurytion died trying to help the dog. And then Geryon himself confronted Hercules in combat. The battle was fierce. Geryon, with his multiple bodies, could attack from different angles simultaneously, and he was strong enough that even Hercules had to respect the threat. But Hercules used his poisoned arrows, shooting through all 3 of Geryon's bodies at once with a single arrow, killing the monster instantly. He gathered the cattle and began the long journey back to Greece, a journey that would take him through Spain, across Gaul, over the Alps, and down through Italy, each region adding new stories and new challenges to his already legendary reputation. When he finally returned to Mycenae with Geryon's cattle, the 10 labors that Eurystheus had originally commanded were complete. But, as mentioned earlier, the king refused to count 2 of them, the Hydra because Hercules had help from Iolaus, and the Augean stables because Hercules had been paid for the work. 2 more labors would be required, and these final 2 would take Hercules to the very boundaries of mortality itself, to places where the living were not meant to go. For the 11th labor, Hercules was sent to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides, mythical fruits that grew in a garden at the edge of the world, tended by nymphs and guarded by Ladon, a 100-headed dragon that never slept. The location of this garden was a mystery. No one knew exactly where it was, and Hercules spent considerable time travelling to various corners of the earth, consulting oracles and wresting information from reluctant gods. His journey took him through incredible adventures. He wrestled with the Old Man of the Sea to force directions from him. He encountered Atlas, the Titan who held the sky on his shoulders as punishment from Zeus, and made a bargain with him if Atlas would retrieve the apples. Since as the father of the Hesperides he could enter the garden without trouble, Hercules would temporarily hold up the sky in his place. Atlas agreed, grateful for even a brief respite from his eternal burden. He retrieved the apples while Hercules stood with the weight of the heavens pressing down on his shoulders, experiencing a fraction of the Titan's punishment. But when Atlas returned with the apples, he announced that he would deliver them to Eurystheus himself. He had no intention of taking back the sky. Hercules, thinking quickly, agreed, but asked Atlas to hold the sky for just a moment while he adjusted his cloak to better cushion his shoulders. Atlas, perhaps made simple by eons of standing in one place, agreed. He took back the sky, and Hercules grabbed the apples and left, leaving Atlas to his eternal punishment. It's a story that shows Hercules at his cleverest, using deception and quick thinking to overcome a problem that strength alone couldn't solve. He returned to Mycenae with the golden apples, which Eurystheus immediately returned to him. The apples were too sacred to keep, and they were eventually returned to the garden by Athena. And then came the 12th labour, the final challenge, the task that Eurystheus had been saving for last, because he was certain it would finally kill the hero he feared and resented. Hercules was commanded to descend into the underworld itself and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades' realm. This was on every level an impossible task. The living were not meant to enter the land of the dead. Those who tried rarely returned, and those who did were changed in ways that destroyed them. Cerberus was not merely a guard dog, it was a divine creature, the offspring of the monsters, Typhon and Echidna, with 3 heads, a serpent for a tail, and snakes growing from its back. Its job was to prevent the dead from leaving the underworld, and it performed that job with perfect, terrifying efficiency. Hercules prepared for the journey by undergoing the Eleusinian mysteries, secret rites that provided initiates with knowledge of death and the afterlife. Then, guided by Hermes and Athena, he descended into the underworld through a deep cave at Cape Taenarum. The journey through Hades' realm was itself a test. He encountered the shades of the dead, witnessed the torments of those being punished, and met heroes from previous generations who recognized him and warned him of the dangers ahead. When Hercules finally reached Hades' throne, he made his request directly. He asked permission to take Cerberus to the surface as his final labor. Hades, lord of the dead, considered the request. And then, in a display of either dark humor or genuine respect for Hercules' achievements, he agreed. But with one condition. Hercules had to subdue Cerberus without using weapons. No club, no arrows, no sword. Just his strength and courage against the guardian of the underworld. Hercules approached Cerberus and did what he had done to the Nemean Lion years before. He grappled with it. The fight was brutal. The dog's 3 heads attacked simultaneously. Its serpent tail struck like a living whip, and the snakes on its back bit at Hercules' arms and legs. But Hercules wrapped his arms around the creatures' necks and squeezed, applying the legendary strength that had strangled a divine lion, that had wrestled bulls and giants and monsters. Cerberus, unable to breathe, unable to escape, finally submitted. Hercules led the 3-headed dog out of the underworld, back through the cave, back into the light of day, a journey that no one had ever completed with such a prize. When he arrived in Mycenae and presented Cerberus to Eurystheus, the king's reaction was predictable. He was terrified beyond reason, hiding in his jar again, begging Hercules to take the monster back to where it came from. Hercules did exactly that. He returned to the underworld, brought Cerberus back to its post at the gates of Hades' realm, and emerged once more into the living world. The 12 labours were complete. 10 years of servitude, extended to 12 labours over even more years, had finally ended. Hercules had faced every challenge that Eurystheus and Hera could devise, and he had survived them all. The labours had taken him to every corner of the known world and beyond. He had strangled beasts with his bare hands, outsmarted titans, journeyed to the land of the dead, and returned. He had lost friends, killed when he didn't intend to, being forced into degrading tasks and impossible challenges. And through it all, he had persevered, driven by the need to atone for the murders he committed in his madness. When it was over, Hercules was free. His penance was complete. And according to the myths, he was promised immortality for his achievements. He would eventually die, but death would not be the end for him. He would be taken to Olympus, transformed into a god, reconciled with Hera, and married to Hebe, the goddess of youth. The man who had killed more monsters than any other hero in Greek mythology would become immortal, not despite his violence, but in some way because of it, because he had channeled that violence into purpose, into service, into atonement. There's something deeply human about Hercules' story, even though it's wrapped in divine parentage and impossible feats. He made a terrible mistake, committed an unforgivable crime, and then spent years, decades really, trying to make up for it. He couldn't bring back his wife and children. He couldn't undo what he'd done. But he could keep fighting, keep enduring, keep facing one impossible challenge after another until the debt was paid. That's what made Hercules the greatest monster slayer in Greek mythology. Not just the number of creatures he defeated, not just the catalogue of impossible victories, but the fact that every single one of those victories was earned through suffering, through penance, through the desperate need to prove that even the worst sins could be redeemed if you were willing to pay the price. Now, when we talk about the greatest monster slayers of Greek mythology, when we catalogue the heroes who walked into darkness and returned victorious, there's a name that deserves special attention. Not because he defeated the most monsters, that honour belongs to Hercules without question. Not because he had the most spectacular adventures. Theseus and his Labyrinth, Bellerophon and his flying horse, they certainly hold their own in that department. No, Perseus deserves our attention because he was, in many ways, the template. He was the original, the hero whose story established patterns that every monster slayer who came after would follow, consciously or not. Perseus was the proof of concept that a hero could face impossible odds, could confront creatures that turned reality itself into a weapon, and could emerge not just alive but victorious, transformed, carrying trophies that redefined what was possible. His story inspired generations of heroes who came after him, including his own great-grandson Hercules, whose 12 labours we've just explored. When later heroes prepared to face their own monsters, they were walking paths that Perseus had carved out first. But before Perseus could become the archetypal hero, before he could face the Gorgon whose gaze turned men to stone, he had to survive a rather determined attempt by his grandfather to prevent his existence entirely. Because Perseus's story, like so many Greek tragedies, began with a prophecy, one of those divine predictions that set in motion the exact events they were meant to prevent. King Acrisius of Argos had a daughter named Danae, and when he consulted the oracle at Delphi about his future, he received the kind of prophecy that no king wants to hear: he would be killed by his grandson. Now, Acrisius could have simply accepted this and enjoyed whatever time he had left, perhaps tried to be a good grandfather in hopes of changing fate through kindness. But that's not how these stories work, and that's certainly not how terrified kings respond to prophecies about their own deaths. Acrisius had no sons, only his daughter Danae. So his solution was simple and brutal: he would ensure that Danae never had children. He imprisoned her in a bronze chamber, or in some versions, a bronze tower, where no man could reach her. It was a prison designed to prevent conception, to stop the prophecy before it could begin. And it probably would have worked if Danae's beauty hadn't caught the attention of Zeus himself. Zeus, being Zeus, was not deterred by something as minor as a bronze prison. in what might be one of mythology's most creative acts of divine seduction or violation, depending on how generous you want to be with your interpretation, Zeus transformed himself into a shower of golden light and infiltrated Danao's prison chamber. 9 months later, Danao gave birth to a son. She named him Perseus. For a time, she managed to hide the child. She kept him secret in that bronze prison, raising him in whispered silence, hoping that her father wouldn't discover what had happened. But children, even half-divine children, are not quiet creatures. When Perseus was 4 years old, Acrisius heard him playing, heard the unmistakable sounds of a young boy's laughter echoing from the chamber that was supposed to hold only his daughter. Acrisius was confronted with a terrible choice. He could kill his daughter and grandson directly, but that would make him a murderer, would bring down curses that even a king couldn't escape. The laws of kinship, the obligations of family, the very structure of civilized society forbade him from spilling their blood with his own hands. So instead, he did something that technically wasn't murder, but absolutely was. He sealed Danae and the young Perseus in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea. It was murder by proxy, death by divine judgment. If the sea claimed them, it was the god's will, not his action. If they drowned, it was fate, not patricide. It's the kind of moral gymnastics that let men sleep at night after doing monstrous things. But Dana and Perseus didn't drown. The chest floated, carried by currents and perhaps guided by divine intervention, until it washed ashore on the island of Seriphus. There, a fisherman named Dictys found it, opened it, and discovered a mother and child who had somehow survived impossible odds. Dictys, being a good man in a mythology not particularly famous for good men, took them in. He offered them protection, shelter, a place in his community. And Perseus grew up on Seriphus, not as a prince of Argos, but as the adopted son of a fisherman, raised with the smell of salt in the air and the sound of waves as his constant companion. Perseus grew into young manhood strong, capable, and aware of his divine parentage. His mother had told him the story of his birth, of Zeus appearing as golden light, of his grandfather's attempt to kill them both. He knew he was different, knew he carried divine blood in his veins, but he also knew the value of the simple, honest life that Dictys had given them. Then King Polydectes of Seriphus complicated everything. Polydectes had seen Danae, and, in the way of powerful men who confused desire with entitlement, decided he wanted to marry her. Danae refused. She had no interest in the king, and more importantly, she had her son to protect. Perseus, now grown and protective of his mother, made his opposition to the marriage very clear. He stood between the king and his mother, an obstacle that Polydectes could not simply remove through force without causing political complications. So Polydectes devised a plan. He announced that he was actually going to marry a different woman, Hippodamia, daughter of King Oenomaus, and he invited all the nobles of his kingdom to contribute gifts for the bride. Everyone was expected to bring horses, which were valuable and appropriate wedding gifts. Perseus, having grown up in a fisherman's household, had no horses to give. When the king pointed this out publicly, humiliating him in front of the court, Perseus made a rash promise in the heat of embarrassment and youthful pride. He declared that he would bring the king any gift he desired, even the head of Medusa herself. Polydectes, who had been counting on exactly this kind of reckless bravado, immediately accepted. He held Perseus to his word, knowing full well that sending the young man to confront Medusa was the same as sentencing him to death. With Perseus gone, killed by the Gorgon, Polydectes would be free to marry Danae without her son's interference. Now, to understand why this was such an effective death sentence, we need to talk about Medusa. She was one of the 3 Gorgon sisters whose names were Medusa, Stheno, and Euryale. Where her sisters were immortal, Medusa was mortal, which made her the only one of the 3 who could theoretically be killed. but theoretically possible and actually achievable, are very different things when the creature in question has the power to turn anyone who looks at her directly into solid stone. Medusa had once been beautiful, a priestess in Athena's temple, renowned for her loveliness. But she had been violated by Poseidon within the sacred temple itself, and Athena, in the kind of victim-blaming that gods seem to specialize in, punished Medusa for the desecration rather than Poseidon for the rape. She transformed Medusa into a monster. Her hair became a mass of living, venomous serpents. Her face became so hideous that anyone who looked directly at it would instantly turn to stone, their flesh and blood transformed into rigid marble in a single heartbeat. Tyche. The Gorgons lived far from civilization, in a desolate place at the edge of the world, surrounded by the stone statues of heroes and warriors who had tried to kill them and failed. Every statue was a warning, a monument to the futility of challenging creatures whose very gaze was death. Perseus set out on his quest fully aware that he was walking toward his own death, but he was also Zeus's son, which meant he had divine blood and potentially divine assistance. And as it turned out, he had caught the attention of two very important gods who had their own reasons for wanting Medusa dead. Athena appeared to him first, the same goddess who had transformed Medusa, now willing to help the hero who would kill her. She gave Perseus a polished bronze shield, so brilliantly reflective that it could serve as a mirror. Then Hermes arrived, the messenger god, the trickster, another of Zeus's children. Hermes provided his own winged sandals, divine footwear that would allow Perseus to fly, and a curved sword called a harp, specifically designed for beheading. But Perseus needed more than weapons and the ability to fly. He needed to know where the Gorgons actually lived, and he needed additional magical items that would give him a fighting chance. For this information, the gods directed him to the Graeae, three ancient sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth among them. The Graeae were neither monsters nor allies. They were something older, something that existed in the grey spaces between categories. They were guardians of forbidden knowledge, and they were not inclined to help heroes on quests. Perseus approached them while they were passing their single eye between them, and in the moment when none of them could see, he stole the eye. It was a hostage situation with an eyeball. Perseus held their vision ransom, refusing to return it until they told him three things: where to find the Gorgons, where to obtain Hades' cap of invisibility, and where to get a magical bag that could safely contain Medusa's head without turning the carrier to stone. The Graeae, desperate to have their eye returned, told him everything. In some versions, they directed him to the Stygian nymphs, who provided the cap and the bag. Now, properly equipped with winged sandals, a cap of invisibility, a mirrored shield, a divine sword, and a bag for his monstrous prize, Perseus flew to the edge of the world where the Gorgons dwelled. When he arrived, he found them sleeping among the stone statues of their victims, a garden of death where every sculpture had once been a living person with hopes and plans and futures. Perseus approached carefully, using the cap of invisibility to conceal himself, using the mirrored shield to see Medusa's reflection rather than looking at her directly. This was the crucial insight that separated Perseus from all the heroes who had tried and failed before him. He understood that Medusa's power required direct eye contact, that her gaze needed to be met to transform flesh to stone. By looking only at her reflection, he could see her without being seen by her, could observe her without triggering the deadly transformation. He hovered above her sleeping form, watching her reflection in his shield. The serpents in her hair writhed even in sleep, hissing softly, their scales catching what little light reached this desolate place. Perseus raised his sword, positioned himself carefully, and with a single powerful strike, beheaded Medusa while she slept. From her severed neck, two creatures emerged: Pegasus, the divine winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword. They were born from her blood, children of Poseidon conceived during the rape that had led to Medusa's transformation. But Perseus didn't stay to marvel at this impossible birth. He grabbed Medusa's head by the serpent hair, stuffed it into his magical bag without looking at it directly, and flew away before Medusa's immortal sisters could wake and pursue him. The return journey took Perseus across vast distances, and along the way he would face his second great monster, though this confrontation began not with combat, but with a moment of extraordinary chance. As Perseus flew over the coast of Ethiopia, he looked down and saw something that made him stop mid-flight, a woman chained to a rock at the edge of the sea, left there as an offering to something terrible. Her name was Andromeda, and she was a princess, the daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia of Ethiopia. Her mother had committed the classic mythological sin of hubris. She had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs who attended Poseidon. The Nereids, offended by this comparison, complained to Poseidon, who responded by sending a massive sea monster, Cetus, to terrorize the Ethiopian coast. The creature destroyed ships, devoured fishermen, and made the sea itself a place of death. When Cepheus consulted an oracle about how to appease the monster, he received an answer that broke his heart. He must sacrifice his daughter Andromeda to the beast. So Andromeda was chained to a rock at the water's edge, dressed in ceremonial robes, left to wait for the monster that would devour her to satisfy the god's wounded pride. Perseus descended from the sky, a young man in winged sandals, carrying a bag that contained the head of a Gorgon, blessed by gods and fresh from an impossible victory. He landed beside Andromeda and made her an offer. If her parents would agree to let him marry her, he would kill the sea monster and save her life. Cepheus and Cassiopeia, watching from the shore and desperate to save their daughter, immediately agreed. They promised Perseus anything he wanted if he could save Andromeda from the fate they had condemned her to. Perseus accepted their terms, and then he waited for Cetus to arrive. The sea monster emerged from the depths like a living nightmare, massive, serpentine, with scales that could turn aside, spears and jaws large enough to swallow a person whole. It moved through the water toward Andromeda with terrible purpose, drawn by the scent of the sacrifice that had been promised to it. Perseus, using the winged sandals to stay airborne, attacked the creature from above. The battle was fierce. Cetus was not some mindless beast, but a divine punishment given form, sent by Poseidon himself. Perseus struck at it with his sword, darting in and out, using his mobility to avoid the creature's attempts to drag him underwater. The fight was brutal and exhausting, with Perseus drawing on every bit of skill and divine favor he possessed. Finally, when the creature's attacks became too fierce, when it seemed that the monster might actually win, Perseus reached into his magical bag and drew out Medusa's head. Even in death, the Gorgon's power remained intact. Perseus held the severed head towards Cetus, forcing the sea monster to look directly at Medusa's face. The transformation was instant. The massive creature turned to stone mid-attack, its serpentine body freezing into rigid rock that crashed into the shallow water with a sound like thunder. Perseus freed Andromeda from her chains, and together they returned to her parents. He claimed his bride, and Andromeda willingly went with him. She had been saved from death by a hero who fell from the sky, and she was ready to begin a new life, far from the parents who had chained her to a rock. But Perseus's journey wasn't finished yet. He still needed to return to Seriphus to fulfill his promise to King Polydectes and, more importantly, to rescue his mother from the king's unwanted advances. When Perseus finally arrived back at the island, he discovered that Polydectes had been harassing Danae in his absence, trying to force her into marriage. Danae and Dictys had taken refuge in a temple, seeking sanctuary from the king's pursuit. Perseus confronted Polydectes in his throne room, where the king was dining with his supporters. when Polydectes mocked him, claiming that Perseus had failed his quest, that he had returned empty-handed and disgraced, Perseus reached into his bag one final time. He told everyone who valued their lives to close their eyes, to look away from what he was about to show them. Then he pulled out Medusa's head and held it toward King Polydectes and all the nobles who had supported him. The transformation was instant and absolute. Every man who had looked at the Gorgon's face turned to stone, frozen in their seats mid-meal, preserved forever as statues in their own dining hall. Perseus had used his monster trophy to create more monsters, turning living men into stone sculptures, ending Polydectes' tyranny with a single gesture. With his mother freed and his promise fulfilled, Perseus gave Medusa's head to Athena, who mounted it on her shield, the Aegis, where it would remain as a symbol of divine protection and a weapon that could turn enemies to stone. He returned the magical items to Hermes, who delivered them back to their divine sources, and then he took Andromeda and Danae, said goodbye to Dictys, and set out for Argos, the kingdom that his grandfather had ruled, the place where his story had truly begun. Perseus had become exactly what the prophecy foretold, the grandson who would be his grandfather's doom. When Acrisius heard that Perseus was returning to claim his inheritance, the old king fled in terror, desperate to avoid the fate that had been predicted decades earlier. But prophecies, as we've learned, cannot be avoided through flight. Years later, Perseus was competing in funeral games held in honor of a foreign king. During the discus throw, one of Perseus's throws went wild, struck a spectator in the audience and killed him instantly. The dead man was Acrisius, who had travelled far to avoid his grandson but had been claimed by fate anyway. The prophecy was fulfilled not through intention or revenge, but through accident, the cruelest irony of all. Everything Acrisius had done to prevent his death had led directly to it. The imprisonment, the chest thrown into the sea, all the years of paranoid flight. None of it mattered. Perseus killed his grandfather exactly as foretold, though he did so without malice, without even knowing who his victim was until after the man was dead. Perseus went on to found the city of Mycenae and establish a dynasty that would produce some of Greece's greatest heroes, including his great-grandson Hercules. He lived a long life with Andromeda, had many children, and died peacefully. One of the few Greek heroes whose story didn't end in tragedy or divine punishment. What made Perseus the original hero, the template for all who came after, was the completeness of his journey. He faced impossible tasks and survived through a combination of divine assistance, clever strategy, and personal courage. He defeated monsters whose powers made them seem invincible by understanding those powers and finding ways to circumvent them. He saved the innocent, claimed his bride, fulfilled terrible prophecies, and established a legacy that would echo through generations. Every hero who came after Perseus, Theseus with his thread through the labyrinth, Bellerophon riding Pegasus to the sky, Hercules strangling the Nemean Lion, was following patterns that Perseus established first. The divine parentage, the impossible quest, the clever solution, the monster defeated, the reward claimed. These became the essential elements of Greek heroism because Perseus demonstrated that they could work, that a mortal man with divine blood and clever thinking could face the impossible and emerge victorious. And Medusa's head, that ultimate trophy, remained a symbol long after Perseus's death. A reminder that even the most terrifying monsters could be defeated, that death itself could be carried in a bag and used as a weapon, that stone statues might once have been living people who looked at something they shouldn't have seen. Now, if Perseus was the original hero, the template that established what heroism could look like, and if Hercules was the ultimate expression of heroic strength pushed to its absolute limits, then Odysseus represented something else entirely. He was the hero who proved that muscle and divine parentage weren't the only paths to victory, that sometimes the most dangerous weapon a man could carry was the one located between his ears. Odysseus, known to the Romans as Ulysses, was the thinking man's monster slayer, the hero whose greatest strength was cunning, and whose victories came not from strangling beasts with his bare hands, but from outsmarting creatures who should have been unbeatable. Temporal Odysseus was king of Ithaca, a relatively small and rocky island that didn't produce mighty warriors through sheer size or wealth, but through necessity and cleverness. He had fought in the Trojan War, had been one of the architects of the Greek victory through his design of the Trojan horse, itself a monument to the power of deception over direct confrontation. But his real test, his true monster-slaying legend, came not during the war itself, but during the 10-year journey home that followed it. This journey, immortalized in Homer's Odyssey, took him across seas filled with creatures and challenges that couldn't be defeated through conventional heroism. These were monsters that required different strategies, different thinking, different kinds of courage. The first great monster Odysseus faced on his journey home was Polyphemus, one of the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants who lived in caves scattered across remote islands, tending their flocks and caring nothing for the laws or customs of civilized peoples. After leaving Troy, Odysseus and his men were blown off course and eventually landed on an island that seemed peaceful enough, abundant with wildlife and vegetation. Driven by curiosity and the need for provisions, Odysseus took 12 of his best men and went exploring. They discovered a large cave stocked with cheese, pens full of lambs and kids, and all the signs of a prosperous shepherd. Odysseus's men urged him to take what they needed and leave immediately, sensing danger in the sheer size of everything around them. The cheese wheels were massive, the pens built for enormous animals, the cave itself like a cathedral carved from stone. But Odysseus, in a moment of curiosity that would cost several of his men their lives, decided to wait and meet the owner of the cave. He wanted to see what sort of host would greet them, what gifts of hospitality might be offered. It was a decision born from the customs of Greek xenia, the sacred laws of hospitality between host and guest, and it was, in retrospect, catastrophically naive. When Polyphemus returned to his cave in the evening, driving his flock of sheep and goats before him, he was truly enormous, a giant even among Cyclopes, with a single eye in the center of his forehead and strength that made Hercules look modest by comparison. He herded his animals into the cave and then rolled a massive boulder across the entrance to seal it shut. A stone so huge that, as Homer tells us, 22 wagons couldn't have moved it. Odysseus and his men were trapped, sealed inside a cave with a creature who had just demonstrated the kind of casual, overwhelming strength that made combat unthinkable. When Polyphemus noticed his uninvited guests, he wasn't pleased. He asked them who they were and what they wanted, and Odysseus, still trying to invoke the laws of hospitality, explained that they were shipwrecked Greeks returning from Troy, and he asked Polyphemus to show them the courtesy that Zeus himself demanded be shown to travelers. Polyphemus's response was simple and chilling. He didn't care about Zeus, didn't fear the gods, and certainly didn't intend to honor any laws about hospitality. Then he grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, smashed their heads against the stone floor of the cave, and ate them. Not cooked, not prepared, just grabbed, killed, and devoured like a predator consuming prey. The men's brains spattered across the floor. Their bones crunched between the Cyclops' teeth, and Odysseus and his remaining companions understood with absolute clarity that they weren't guests in this cave, they were food. The next morning, Polyphemus ate 2 more men for breakfast, then rolled away the stone, led his flock out to pasture, and rolled the stone back into place, sealing Odysseus and the survivors inside like animals in a pen. This was the key problem that separated Odysseus's situation from typical monster-slaying scenarios. He couldn't simply kill the Cyclops, even if he could find a way to kill such an enormous creature, and that was already doubtful. Doing so would trap them permanently in the cave. The boulder blocking the entrance was far too large for any number of men to move. They needed Polyphemus alive to open the cave, which meant they needed a solution that would disable him without killing him. While Polyphemus was out with his flock, Odysseus and his men explored the cave and found a massive wooden staff, a piece of olive wood as thick as a ship's mast, which Polyphemus used as a walking stick. Odysseus ordered his men to sharpen one end of this staff into a point, to harden the point in the fire, and then to hide it under the piles of dung that littered the cave floor. It was a weapon, yes, but not one designed to kill. It was designed for something far more specific. When Polyphemus returned that evening and ate 2 more men for dinner, because apparently the Cyclops had the appetite of something truly monstrous. Odysseus approached him with an offering. He had brought with him from his ship a skin of extraordinarily strong wine, undiluted and potent, a gift from a priest of Apollo. Odysseus offered this wine to Polyphemus, presenting it as a gesture of goodwill, a drink to accompany his meal of human flesh. The irony was bitter, but Odysseus maintained his composure. Polyphemus drank the wine and was delighted by it. He had never tasted anything so strong, so sweet, so intoxicating. He demanded more, drank deeply, and then, in a moment of what might have been genuine pleasure or simple drunken curiosity, asked Odysseus for his name, promising a gift in return. The kind of gift that a man-eating giant offers is never encouraging. Tea. And here's where Odysseus demonstrated the quality that separated him from heroes like Hercules or Theseus. He lied, brilliantly, perfectly, with a deception so clever that it would save his life. He told Polyphemus that his name was Nobody, in Greek, Autus, which sounds like a real name but means exactly what it says, nobody. Polyphemus, drunk and pleased, announced that his gift would be to eat Nobody last after he'd consumed all of Nobody's companions. Then the Cyclops collapsed into drunken sleep. Odysseus and his men pulled the sharpened stake from its hiding place and heated the point in the fire until it glowed red-hot, until the wood itself seemed to be burning from within. Then, with 4 men helping to drive it forward and Odysseus guiding the strike, they rammed the burning stake directly into Polyphemus's single eye. The descriptions in Homer are visceral, the eye hissing and boiling around the wooden stake like metal being tempered in water, the eyeball bursting, the roots of the eye crackling in the flame. Polyphemus awoke with a scream that echoed across the island, a roar of agony that brought other Cyclopes running to his cave to see what had happened. They gathered outside and called to Polyphemus, asking who was attacking him, who was trying to kill him. And Polyphemus, blind and in terrible pain, shouted back exactly what Odysseus had counted on him, saying, "Nobody is attacking me, nobody is trying to kill me." The other Cyclopes, hearing this, assumed that Polyphemus had gone mad or was being punished by the gods for some offense. If nobody was attacking him, then there was nothing they could do to help. They returned to their own caves, leaving Polyphemus alone with his agony and his rage. But Odysseus still had to escape. Polyphemus, though blind, positioned himself at the mouth of the cave when morning came, rolling away the stone to let his flock out to pasture, but sitting in the entrance to feel each animal as it passed, determined to catch the Greeks if they tried to sneak out among the sheep. Odysseus's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He tied his men beneath the bellies of Polyphemus's largest rams, binding them to the thick wool with willow branches, 3 sheep to each man, with the middle one carrying the hidden Greek. When the flock filed out of the cave, Polyphemus felt the tops and sides of each animal, checking for men riding on their backs, but he never thought to check underneath. One by one, Odysseus's surviving men escaped, clinging to the sheep's bellies, passing directly beneath the blind Cyclops' searching hands. Odysseus himself went last, tied to the underside of Polyphemus's favourite ram, the largest and finest animal in the flock, the one the Cyclops loved most. When this ram passed through the entrance, Polyphemus held it for a moment, speaking to it with surprising tenderness, wondering why his favourite was last to leave the cave when usually it led the flock. He didn't realize he was speaking to the ram that carried his tormentor. When they were clear of the cave and safely aboard their ship, when they had pushed off from shore and were rowing away, Odysseus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his journey. He couldn't resist calling back to Polyphemus, taunting the blind Cyclops, revealing that he had been outwitted and defeated. And then, in a moment of pride that transformed victory into curse, Odysseus shouted his real name, not nobody, but Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes, sacker of cities. True Polyphemus, hearing the name of his tormentor, called out to his father Poseidon, god of the sea, and cursed Odysseus with terrible specificity. He prayed that Odysseus would never reach home, or if fate decreed he must return, that he would arrive late, alone, having lost all his companions, in someone else's ship, and find trouble waiting for him when he got there. Poseidon heard his son's prayer, and that curse would define the rest of Odysseus's journey. 10 years to travel what should have taken weeks, every one of his companions dead, arriving finally in Ithaca to find his home overrun with men trying to marry his wife and steal his kingdom. But before that curse fully manifested, Odysseus would face other monsters, other impossible challenges. And perhaps the most psychologically terrifying of these were the sirens, creatures whose danger wasn't in their claws or teeth but in their voices, in the irresistible beauty of their song. The sirens lived on a rocky island, and they sang with voices so beautiful, so compelling, so perfectly calibrated to human desire that no sailor who heard them could resist. Ships would veer toward the island, sailors abandoning their duties to row toward the source of the singing, and the ships would crash on the rocks. The Sirens' Island was surrounded by the bones of those who had listened, a beach made of shipwrecks and skeletons, testament to the lethal power of beauty without mercy. Odysseus had been warned about the sirens by the sorceress Circe, who told him that if he wished to hear their song and survive, and this is key, because Odysseus wanted to hear it, wanted to experience something that no other man had experienced and lived, he would need to take precautions. She told him to have his men fill their ears with beeswax, blocking out all sound, making them deaf to the siren's call. But if Odysseus himself wanted to hear the singing, he would need to be bound to the mast of his ship with ropes so tight he couldn't possibly break free, and he would need to order his men explicitly and in advance not to release him no matter how much he begged. Odysseus followed these instructions precisely. As they approached the Sirens' Island, he had his crew seal their ears with wax, and then he had them tie him to the mast with layer upon layer of rope, binding him so completely that he could barely move. He ordered them that if he commanded them to untie him, they should tie him tighter. And then they sailed past the island, and Odysseus heard what no man who had lived had ever heard. The sirens sang, and their song was everything: knowledge, beauty, the promise of understanding all that had happened at Troy, all that would happen in the future, all the secrets of the world laid bare. They sang with voices like honey and promises like paradise, and Odysseus, hearing them, was instantly completely consumed with the need to reach them. He screamed at his men to untie him, ordered them to turn the ship toward the island, begged and commanded and threatened. But his crew, deaf to both the sirens and to his commands, simply rowed harder, and some of them, seeing him struggle, added more ropes, binding him tighter to the mast as he'd instructed. They sailed past the Sirens' Island, and when they were beyond the reach of the singing, when the spell broke and Odysseus returned to his senses, his men untied him. He had heard the sirens and survived, not through strength, not through combat, but through preparation, through accepting his own weakness and planning around it. It was perhaps the most Odysseus-like victory in all his adventures, winning by acknowledging that he would lose if he trusted himself in the moment. But the journey wasn't over. Soon after, Odysseus faced what might be the most impossible choice in all of Greek mythology, the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, two monsters who made the passage between them essentially a choice about how you wanted to die. Charybdis was a whirlpool, but not a natural one. This was a creature, or perhaps a curse-given form, that lived beneath the waves and 3 times a day would swallow enormous quantities of seawater, creating a vortex so powerful that it would pull entire ships down into the depths. No one who was caught in Charybdis's whirlpool survived. The water itself became a weapon, dragging ships and sailors down to be crushed against the rocks at the bottom of the sea. On the opposite side of the strait, close enough that you couldn't avoid both monsters simultaneously, was Scylla. She had once been a beautiful nymph, but after being transformed by jealous magic, she had become something genuinely nightmarish, a creature with 6 long necks, each topped with a head filled with rows of shark-like teeth, and from her waist down she was surrounded by barking dog heads that snapped at anything that came within reach. Scylla lived in a cave high on the cliff face, and when ships passed beneath her, she would strike with terrifying speed, each head darting down to snatch a sailor from the deck and devour him. Circe had warned Odysseus about this passage and had given him terrible counsel. There was no way to fight both monsters. If he steered toward Charybdis to avoid Scylla, the whirlpool would take his entire ship and all his men. If he steered toward Scylla to avoid Charybdis, he would lose 6 men, 1 to each of Scylla's heads, but the ship and the rest of his crew would survive. It wasn't a choice between victory and defeat, it was a choice between catastrophic loss and merely terrible loss. Odysseus made the decision that any leader would hate to make, but that the circumstances demanded. He steered close to Scylla's cliff, accepting that he would sacrifice 6 of his men to save the rest. He didn't tell his crew what was about to happen. There was no point in terrifying them in advance, no way for them to prepare for a threat that struck from above with impossible speed. As they rowed through the strait, staying as far from Charybdis as possible, Scylla struck. Her 6 heads darted down from her cave with the speed of striking serpents, and each one seized a man from the ship's deck. Odysseus's men screamed his name as they were lifted into the air, calling out for help that couldn't come, reaching toward their companions as Scylla drew them up to her cave to be devoured. Odysseus watched it happen, unable to do anything, forced by his own strategic decision to witness the deaths of 6 of his companions. He would later say that of all the horrors he witnessed in his 10-year journey, that moment, watching his men being carried away, hearing them call his name, was the most painful. But the ship survived. The rest of his crew survived. They passed through the strait, leaving Scylla and Charybdis behind, carrying with them the knowledge that sometimes survival means accepting losses that feel unacceptable, that leadership sometimes requires choosing who will die so that others might live. This was Odysseus's particular genius as a monster slayer. He understood that not every monster could be defeated, that some challenges weren't about winning, but about surviving, about making impossible choices and living with the consequences. He didn't strangle monsters with his bare hands like Hercules. He didn't charge into battle with divine weapons like Perseus. Instead, he thought his way through problems, used deception and strategy, accepted his limitations, and found ways to emerge alive from situations that killed everyone else. Polyphemus was defeated not through combat but through a false name and a burning stake. The sirens were survived not through resistance but through recognizing that resistance would be impossible and planning accordingly. Scylla and Charybdis were overcome not by defeating them but by accepting loss as the price of passage. Odysseus proved that there was more than one way to be a hero, that cunning and intelligence were weapons just as powerful as strength and divine favor. He inspired generations of trickster heroes who came after him, who understood that the clever solution was sometimes the only solution, that survival could be as heroic as victory. and when he finally reached Ithaca after 10 years of wandering, after all his companions had died and all his ships were lost, he arrived exactly as Polyphemus's curse had promised, late, alone, in someone else's ship, to find his home full of trouble. But he handled that trouble the way he'd handled everything else, with cunning, with strategy, and with the understanding that sometimes the best way to defeat your enemies is to make them underestimate you until it's too late. That's the legacy of Odysseus, the hero who proved that the mind could be mightier than the sword, that sometimes the greatest monster slayer is the one who never looks like a warrior at all. Now, if Odysseus proved that cunning could be as powerful as strength, that the mind could defeat monsters that muscles couldn't touch, then Oedipus took that concept even further. He faced a monster that couldn't be fought at all, not with swords, not with clubs, not with divine weapons or clever tactics. The Sphinx of Thebes was a creature whose power lay entirely in language, in riddles, in the ability to ask questions that had only one correct answer and infinite ways to be wrong. Oedipus defeated this monster not through physical combat but through pure intellect, through understanding, through being able to see the truth hidden within words. But before we get to that moment of intellectual triumph, we need to understand the tragedy that surrounded it. Because Oedipus's story isn't just about defeating a monster, it's about how victory can be the first step toward devastation, how solving one riddle can blind you to the deeper riddles embedded in your own life. Oedipus would become the most famous tragic figure in all of Greek mythology, the man whose name became synonymous with terrible self-knowledge and the dangers of fate. But when he encountered the Sphinx, he was just a young man on the road, fleeing from a prophecy he thought he could escape. Oedipus had been raised in Corinth by King Polybus and Queen Merope, believing them to be his true parents. But when he consulted the oracle at Delphi about his future, he received a prophecy so horrifying that it drove him to leave everything behind. He was told that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Determined to prevent this fate, Oedipus fled Corinth, reasoning that as long as he stayed away from Polybus and Merope, the prophecy could never come true. It was the same kind of logical thinking that would later allow him to solve the Sphinx's riddle, and it was just as catastrophically wrong about the deeper truth. On the road between Delphi and Thebes, at a place where 3 roads met, Oedipus encountered a small group of travelers, an old man in a chariot with several attendants. The road was narrow, and when the old man's herald ordered Oedipus to step aside and let his betters pass, when they tried to force him off the road, Oedipus's temper flared. A fight broke out, and Oedipus, in his rage, killed the old man and most of his attendants, leaving only one survivor who fled into the wilderness. Oedipus continued on his way, believing he'd simply dispatched some arrogant nobles who had insulted him. He had no idea that the old man was King Laius of Thebes, his actual biological father. 2. The prophecy had begun to fulfill itself, and Oedipus walked toward Thebes completely unaware that he was already a patricide. When he approached the city, he found it in a state of terror. The Sphinx had taken up residence on a rocky outcropping outside Thebes, and she was systematically destroying the city without ever setting foot inside it. The creature was magnificent and terrible. She had the head and upper body of a woman, the body and paws of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the tail of a serpent. She was a hybrid, a composite of different forms, which made her symbolically appropriate as the guardian of a riddle about transformation and change. Oh my! The Sphinx would stop travelers on the road to Thebes and pose a riddle to them. If they answered correctly, she would let them pass. If they failed, and everyone failed, she would devour them. Some accounts say she would strangle them first, crushing them in her claws, which is appropriate given that her name comes from the Greek word sphingein, meaning to squeeze or to strangle. The ground around her perch was littered with bones, the remains of all those who had tried and failed to answer her question. Thebes was paralyzed. No one could enter or leave the city without risking an encounter with the Sphinx. Trade stopped. Communication with the outside world ceased. The city was under siege by a single creature armed with nothing more than a question. King Laius had set out to consult the oracle about how to deal with the Sphinx, which is why he was on the road when Oedipus killed him. With the king dead and the Sphinx still terrorizing the roads, Thebes was desperate. The temporary ruler, Creon Laius's brother-in-law, made a proclamation. Whoever could defeat the Sphinx and free the city would be given the throne of Thebes and the hand of Queen Jocasta, Laius's widow, in marriage. It was a desperate offer, but these were desperate times. When Oedipus arrived at the approach to Thebes and encountered the Sphinx, he had nothing to lose. He was an exile, fleeing from a prophecy, carrying the guilt of having killed several men on the road. If the Sphinx killed him, at least he would die knowing he'd escaped the fate of killing his father and marrying his mother, or so he thought. The Sphinx regarded him from her rocky perch, this young man who approached when so many others had tried to avoid her, and she posed her famous riddle. The exact wording varies depending on which ancient source you consult, but the essence was this: what creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? It's a riddle that seems impenetrable at first. What animal changes its number of legs throughout the day? The immediate impulse is to think literally, to catalogue creatures and try to find one that matches the description. But the Sphinx's riddle wasn't about biology. It was about metaphor, about understanding that morning, noon, and evening weren't referring to times of day, but to stages of life. Oedipus stood before the Sphinx and thought. He didn't panic, didn't guess wildly, didn't try to flee. He engaged with the riddle seriously, turning it over in his mind, looking for the pattern, the key that would unlock its meaning. And then he saw it, the elegant simplicity hidden within the seemingly impossible question. "Man," he answered. "Man," he answered. He explained, "A human being crawls on all 4s as an infant in the morning of life. An adult walks upright on 2 legs at the noon of life, and an elderly person uses a cane, walking on 3 legs in the evening of life." The riddle wasn't about a creature that physically changed throughout a single day, but about a being that metaphorically changed throughout a lifetime. It was about transformation, about the inevitable progression of human existence from helplessness to strength to frailty. The answer was perfect. It was correct. And in some traditions, it was also deeply personal. Oedipus himself had been injured as an infant, his ankles pierced and bound, which gave him his name Oedipus, meaning swollen foot. He was answering a riddle about human life stages while carrying in his own body the evidence of his unusual beginning. He was solving a puzzle about walking while bearing the scars of having been prevented from walking as a child. According to some sources, the Sphinx wasn't finished. She posed a second riddle, perhaps testing to see if the first answer was luck or genuine insight. There are 2 sisters. One gives birth to the other, who in turn gives birth to the first. Who are the 2 sisters? Wick. Oedipus answered this one as well, day and night. 2 concepts that are both feminine in Greek, that alternate eternally, each one emerging from the other in an endless cycle. 2 riddles, 2 correct answers. The Sphinx had finally encountered someone whose intellect matched the challenge she posed, and faced with defeat, faced with the failure of her purpose, the Sphinx destroyed herself. In most versions of the story, she threw herself from the rock where she had perched, dashing herself to pieces on the ground below. In other versions, she devoured herself in despair. Either way, her death was immediate and final. A monster whose power lay entirely in an unanswered question had no reason to exist once that question had been answered. Oedipus had defeated the Sphinx without drawing a weapon, without violence, without divine assistance. He had done it through intellect alone, through the ability to think abstractly, to see metaphorical meaning, to understand that language could contain layers of truth that weren't immediately visible. It was perhaps the purest intellectual victory in all of Greek mythology. The people of Thebes rejoiced. The siege was lifted, the roads were safe again, and true to his word, Creon gave Oedipus both the throne and the hand of Queen Jocasta in marriage. Oedipus entered Thebes as a hero, a savior, a king. He had solved the unsolvable riddle and freed the city from terror. He was celebrated, honored, loved. And he had absolutely no idea that he had just married his own mother, that he had already killed his father, that every step he'd taken to avoid the prophecy had brought it to fulfillment. The man who could solve the Sphinx's riddle about human life couldn't see the truth of his own life. The hero who understood metaphor and hidden meaning was blind to the most important truth of all. This is what makes Oedipus such a tragic figure, and what makes his defeat of the Sphinx so bitterly ironic. He proved that intelligence could defeat monsters, that pure intellect was a weapon as powerful as any sword. But he also proved that some riddles are impossible to solve until it's too late, that self-knowledge can be the hardest knowledge to obtain, that you can be brilliant and still be blind. Years later, when a plague descended on Thebes and the oracle revealed that it was caused by the presence of a murderer, the killer of King Laius Oedipus would use that same intellectual rigor to investigate. He would pursue the truth with the same relentless logic he'd used on the Sphinx's riddle. And he would discover, piece by terrible piece, that he was the murderer he sought, that Jocasta was his mother, that his children were also his siblings, that the prophecy he'd spent his entire life trying to escape had been fulfilled completely. Jocasta would hang herself upon learning the truth. Oedipus would blind himself with her brooch pins, destroying his physical sight as punishment for his metaphorical blindness. And he would go into exile, led by his daughter Antigone, transformed from a celebrated king into a cursed wanderer. But in that moment outside Thebes, facing the Sphinx, Oedipus was simply a hero. He was the man who proved that monsters could be defeated with words, with thought, with the courage to engage with questions that had destroyed everyone else who'd tried to answer them. The Sphinx represented a particular kind of threat, not physical danger but intellectual challenge, the demand that you prove your worth through understanding rather than through strength. Oedipus met that challenge and won. He showed that heroism didn't require divine parentage or magical weapons or even particularly impressive physical abilities. It required intelligence, courage, and the willingness to think clearly when everyone else had failed. He inspired generations of heroes who would face their own challenges through wit rather than force, who understood that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones that make you think. The riddle of the Sphinx became one of the most famous puzzles in Western culture, a symbol of the kind of challenge that requires you to see beyond the literal, to understand metaphor and deeper meaning. And Oedipus became the archetypal figure of tragic knowledge, the man who could solve any riddle except the one written in his own life, who could see everything except what was most important to see. That's the legacy of Oedipus and the Sphinx. Intelligence can defeat monsters, but it can't always save you from fate. Sometimes the greatest victory plants the seeds of the greatest tragedy. Sometimes solving the riddle is just the beginning of a much longer, much darker story. And sometimes the monster you defeat is less dangerous than the truth you're running from. Now, if we've learned anything from the heroes we've discussed so far, it's that there are many paths to monster-slaying glory. Hercules proved that raw strength and endurance could overcome impossible odds. Perseus demonstrated that divine assistance and clever strategy could defeat creatures whose very nature made them unbeatable. Odysseus showed that cunning alone could navigate through horrors that would destroy stronger men. Oedipus revealed that pure intellect could be a weapon against monsters whose power resided in questions rather than claws. But Jason represents something else entirely. He was the hero who proved that you didn't have to do it alone, that love and alliance could be as powerful as any weapon, and that sometimes the greatest heroism lies not in refusing help, but in accepting it from unexpected sources. Jason was the leader of the Argonauts, commander of perhaps the greatest assembly of heroes ever gathered on a single ship, but his most important alliance, his most crucial partnership, came from a woman who would betray her own father and her own kingdom for love of him. Jason's story began, as so many Greek hero stories did, with betrayal and stolen thrones. His father Aeson was the rightful king of Iolcus in Thessaly, but Aeson's half-brother Peleus had seized the throne through violence and treachery. To protect the infant Jason from his uncle's murderous ambitions, Jason's mother spirited him away to Mount Pelion, where he was raised by Chiron the centaur, the same legendary teacher who had trained Hercules and would train Achilles. Chiron taught Jason everything a hero should know: combat, diplomacy, medicine, music, the arts of civilization, and the skills of survival. When Jason reached manhood, around 20 years old, he descended from the mountain and travelled to Iolcus to claim his birthright. On the way, he encountered an old woman at a river crossing. In reality, the goddess Hera in disguise, testing him, and he carried her across the swollen waters. In the process, he lost one of his sandals, arriving at Peleus's court wearing only one shoe, which was significant because Peleus had received a prophecy warning him to beware of a man who would come to him with one sandal. Peleus recognized the danger immediately. This young man was Jason, the rightful heir, the nephew he'd thought safely hidden away. Peleus could have killed him outright, but that would risk uprising, would make Jason a martyr. So instead, Peleus did what threatened kings always do. He set an impossible task. He told Jason about the Golden Fleece. The Golden Fleece was the skin of a divine ram that had once saved two children, Phrixus and Helle, from being sacrificed by their wicked stepmother. The ram had carried them across the sea towards safety, but Helle fell from its back and drowned in the strait that would thereafter be called the Hellespont in her memory. Phrixus survived, reaching the distant kingdom of Colchis on the eastern shore of the Black Sea, where King Aeetes received him kindly. Phrixus sacrificed the ram to Zeus and gave its golden fleece to Aeetes, who hung it in a sacred grove dedicated to Ares, where it was guarded by a sleepless dragon. Peleus told Jason that there was a curse on the family of Athamas, the father who had been willing to sacrifice his children, and that curse could only be lifted by returning the Golden Fleece to Greece. If Jason could retrieve the fleece from Colchis, Peleus would willingly give up the throne. It was, of course, a death sentence dressed up as a quest. Colchis was at the edge of the known world, thousands of miles away across treacherous seas, and the fleece was guarded by a monster that never slept. Peleus was certain that Jason would die in the attempt, and if by some miracle he didn't die on the journey, the dragon would certainly kill him. Jason accepted the challenge, but he understood something that Peleus hadn't fully considered. He didn't have to face these challenges alone. Jason sent out a call across Greece, gathering heroes to join him on his quest. The greatest warriors and adventurers of the age answered that call, attracted by the promise of glory, adventure, and the chance to be part of something legendary. They called themselves the Argonauts, named after the ship that would carry them, the Argo, a vessel built with divine assistance that some sources claimed could speak and prophesy. Among the Argonauts were some of the most famous names in Greek mythology. Hercules himself joined for part of the journey, bringing his massive strength to the expedition. Orpheus the musician came, whose songs could charm rocks and trees. Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, lent their skills. Atalanta, the great huntress, sailed with them in some versions. Theseus, the slayer of the Minotaur, was said to have been among the crew. It was an assembly of heroes unprecedented in scope, a dream team of monster slayers and adventurers. The journey to Colchis was itself an epic of encounters and challenges. They faced storms, hostile kingdoms, the bronze giant Talos who guarded the shores of Crete, the Symplegades or clashing rocks that crushed ships attempting to pass through the strait leading to the Black Sea. But eventually, after months of travel and adventure, the Argo arrived at Colchis, and Jason presented himself to King Aeetes. Aeetes was not pleased to see Greek adventurers on his shores demanding his sacred treasure, but he couldn't simply refuse them without seeming inhospitable, without violating the guest-host obligations that governed civilized behavior. So instead, like Peleus before him, Aeetes set impossible tasks. He told Jason that he could take the Golden Fleece if, and only if, he could complete 3 challenges that no mortal man had ever accomplished. First, Jason would have to yoke a pair of fire-breathing bulls, the Calcatoroi, bronze-hoofed creatures given to Aeetes by the god Hephaestus himself. These weren't ordinary bulls made monstrous through size or strength. They were divine constructs, mechanical creatures that exhaled flames hot enough to incinerate anything that came near them. Just approaching them would be suicide, let alone yoking them to a plough. Second, once he'd somehow yoked these fire-breathing bulls, Jason would have to use them to plough a field. Third, he would have to sow that field with dragon's teeth. Actual teeth from a dragon that had been slain by Cadmus, founder of Thebes, which Athena had given to Aeetes. These teeth, when planted, would sprout into fully armed warriors called Spartoi, who would emerge from the ground and immediately attack whoever had planted them. And if by some miracle Jason survived all that, he would still have to face the sleepless dragon that guarded the Golden Fleece itself, a serpent so enormous, so vigilant, that it had never closed its eyes since being posted to watch over the fleece. Jason heard these conditions and felt despair settling over him like a funeral shroud. This wasn't just difficult, it was genuinely impossible. Aeetes had designed these tasks specifically to ensure Jason's death. No amount of strength or skill or heroic bravery could overcome fire-breathing bulls and warriors who sprang from the earth itself. But Jason had something that Aeetes hadn't accounted for, something that would prove more powerful than any weapon the Argonauts carried. He had caught the attention of Hera, who had been helping him since that river crossing where he'd carried her in disguise. And Hera, seeing Jason's despair, decided to intervene in the most effective way possible, through love. Hera convinced Aphrodite to have her son Eros shoot one of his arrows at Medea, the daughter of King Aeetes. Medea was no ordinary princess. She was a powerful sorceress, a priestess of Hecate, skilled in potions and magic that could rival the gods themselves. When Eros's arrow struck her, when she saw Jason for the first time at her father's court, she fell instantly, completely, devastatingly in love. The love was genuine, even if it was divinely induced. Medea looked at Jason and saw something worth saving, worth helping, worth betraying her own father for. And Jason, desperate and facing impossible odds, recognized that this woman held the key to his survival. Medea approached Jason in secret and made him an offer. She would help him complete all of Aeetes' impossible tasks, but in return, Jason had to promise to take her back to Greece as his wife. Jason, who had no other options and who may have genuinely felt something for this powerful, passionate woman who was willing to risk everything for him, agreed immediately. For the first task, the fire-breathing bulls, Medea prepared a special ointment made from herbs and magic, a salve that would protect Jason from fire. She instructed him to coat his entire body with this ointment and to cover his shield and sword with it as well. The next morning, when Jason approached the Calcatoroi, when those bronze bulls exhaled flames that should have reduced him to ash, the fire washed over him harmlessly. His skin didn't blister, his hair didn't burn. The magical ointment turned him into something temporarily impervious to flame. Jason grabbed the bulls by their horns. Imagine the audacity of that, grabbing creatures that breathed fire, mechanical monsters given to a king by the god of the forge himself, and forced them to their knees. He yoked them to a plough, and under his control they ploughed the sacred field of Ares, just as Aeetes had demanded. The king watched, stunned that this Greek stranger had survived what should have been immediate incineration. Then came the second task. Jason took the dragon's teeth and sowed them in the freshly ploughed field, walking the rows and planting death like a farmer planting crops, and as soon as the teeth were covered with earth, the soil began to move. Hands burst through the ground, skeletal at first, then fleshing themselves with impossible speed. Warriors emerged fully formed and fully armed, pulling themselves from the earth like some nightmare harvest, swords already drawn, eyes already locked on Jason. But Medea had warned Jason about this, had told him exactly what to do. As the Spartoi emerged and surrounded him, as they raised their weapons to attack, Jason picked up a large rock and threw it into the middle of their formation. The rock struck one of the warriors, who immediately turned on his neighbour, assuming he had been attacked by a comrade. That warrior struck back. Within seconds, the entire army of earthborn soldiers was fighting each other, unable to determine where the attack had come from, slashing and stabbing at their own brothers while Jason stood unharmed at the edge of the field. The Spartoi destroyed each other completely, until not a single one remained standing. Jason had survived the second task through Medea's wisdom, not through strength, but through understanding the nature of the enemy, through exploiting confusion and turning the monster's own violence against itself. Tubbly Aeetes watched all this with growing rage and growing fear. This stranger had completed tasks that should have been impossible. The fire-breathing bulls hadn't killed him. The dragon-tooth warriors had failed. Something was wrong, and Aeetes suspected correctly that his daughter was involved. He told Jason that he could attempt to take the golden fleece from the sacred grove, but Aeetes was already planning treachery. He intended to burn the Argo and kill all the Argonauts before Jason could complete his quest. But Medea, reading her father's intentions, moved first. She went to Jason that night and told him they needed to act immediately, before Aeetes could spring his trap. Together, they crept through the darkness to the sacred grove of Ares, where the golden fleece hung from an oak tree, glowing with divine light, watched over by the dragon that never slept. The dragon was enormous. Accounts vary on the exact size, but all agree it was massive, with coils thick enough to crush a man and jaws large enough to swallow him whole. It had eyes that never closed, a vigilance that had been perfect for years. It was the ultimate guardian, the final impossible obstacle. Medea stepped forward, carrying a potion she had distilled from powerful herbs, mandrake, nightshade, poppies, things that grew in shadow and carried sleep in their essence. She began to sing, chanting words of power, invoking Hecate and the dark gods who governed sleep and death. The dragon, which had never slept, which had never even drowsed in all its years of service, began to grow sluggish. Its eyes, which had been sharp and alert, started to dim. Medea sprayed her potion directly into those ancient eyes, and the dragon, impossibly, miraculously, fell asleep. Its massive head lowered to the ground, its coils relaxed. For the first time in its existence, the dragon that guarded the golden fleece was unconscious, vulnerable, defeated not through violence but through magic and knowledge. Jason moved quickly. He climbed the oak tree, took down the golden fleece, that legendary prize, that symbol of kingship and power, the object that had been guarded by impossibilities, and wrapped it around his shoulders. Then he grabbed Medea's hand, and together they ran through the darkness toward the Argo, where the Argonauts were already preparing to sail. When Aeetes discovered that both the fleece and his daughter were gone, he was apoplectic with rage. He launched ships immediately, giving chase across the Black Sea, determined to kill Jason and retrieve both his treasure and his traitorous daughter. This is where the story becomes particularly dark. where Medea revealed just how far she was willing to go to ensure their escape. In the most common version, Medea had brought her younger brother Apsyrtus with them. Whether he came willingly or was kidnapped depends on which account you read. As Aeetes' ships gained on the Argo, as it became clear they might be overtaken, Medea made a terrible decision. She killed her own brother, dismembered his body, and threw the pieces into the sea behind them. She knew her father would stop to gather the pieces of his son for proper burial, and she was right. Aeetes' ships stopped, as the king gathered what remained of his child from the waves. By the time he could resume pursuit, the Argo was too far ahead to catch. Jason had obtained the Golden Fleece, but the cost was higher than anyone could have imagined. Medea had betrayed her father, murdered her brother, turned her back on her homeland and her people, all for love of a man she'd only just met. And Jason had allowed it all to happen, had accepted her help knowing what it would cost her, knowing that she was destroying her own life to save his. This is what makes Jason's story so complex, so morally ambiguous. He defeated the monsters, the fire-breathing bulls, the dragon-tooth warriors, the sleepless dragon. But he didn't defeat them alone, and he didn't defeat them through his own heroism. Every victory was enabled by Medea, every impossible task overcome through her magic and her willingness to betray everything she'd known. Jason was the leader of the Argonauts, yes, but he was successful not because of his own qualities, but because a woman loved him enough to become a monster herself. When they finally returned to Iolcus with the Golden Fleece, when Jason presented it to Peleus and demanded the throne he'd been promised, the story should have had a heroic ending. But it didn't, because Peleus refused to honor his word, and Medea, who had already proven what she was willing to do for Jason, took matters into her own hands. She tricked Peleus's daughters into killing their own father, promising them it would make him young again. It didn't. Jason and Medea were forced into exile, driven from Iolcus as murderers. Eventually, Jason would betray Medea, would abandon her to marry a younger princess, a politically advantageous match that would secure his position. And Medea, driven mad by betrayal, would murder their children and Jason's new bride before fleeing in a chariot pulled by dragons. Jason would die alone and forgotten, killed when a piece of the rotting Argo fell on him as he sat in its shadow, remembering better days. It's a tragedy from beginning to end, but it taught important lessons about heroism and monster slaying. Jason proved that you could defeat impossible monsters through alliance, through accepting help, through recognizing that love and magic could be weapons as powerful as any sword. But he also proved that victories won through others' sacrifices carry a debt that eventually comes due, that using people, even people who love you, has consequences that can destroy everything you've built. The fire-breathing bulls, the dragon-tooth warriors, the sleepless dragon, all defeated, all overcome, but not through the traditional heroic methods. Jason's monster slaying was collaborative, dependent, morally complicated. He was a hero who needed a heroine, a leader who required a partner, and ultimately a man who couldn't survive without the woman he eventually betrayed. That's the legacy of Jason and the Golden Fleece. Sometimes the greatest victories come at the greatest cost, and sometimes the monsters we defeat are less dangerous than the debts we accumulate in defeating them. Now, if Jason's story taught us that victory can come at too high a cost, that using others' sacrifices eventually demands payment, then Cadmus's tale offers something different, something older, more fundamental. Because Cadmus wasn't just a monster slayer, he was a founder, a civilization builder, a hero whose defeat of a dragon became the literal foundation of one of Greece's greatest cities. His monster slaying wasn't an end in itself, but the beginning of something larger, the violent act that preceded creation, the blood spilled that made culture possible. Cadmus was, alongside Perseus and Bellerophon, considered one of the greatest heroes before the age of Heracles, part of that first generation of monster slayers who established the patterns that later heroes would follow. But there was something unique about his origin. Cadmus wasn't Greek, he was Phoenician, a prince of Tyre, the son of King Agenor and Queen Telephassa. In Greek terms, he was a barbarian, a foreigner who would become the founder of one of their most important cities. It's a fascinating cultural acknowledgement. The admission that civilization sometimes arrives from outside, that greatness can have foreign origins. Cadmus's journey began, as so many hero journeys did, with a family crisis and impossible demands. His sister Europa, yes, the same Europa whose name would eventually grace a continent, had been playing on the shores of Phoenicia when Zeus noticed her. Zeus, in his typical fashion, transformed himself into a magnificent white bull, approached the unsuspecting princess, and when she climbed onto his back out of curiosity, carried her across the sea to Crete, where he revealed his true nature and took her as his lover. King Agenor, discovering his daughter had vanished, commanded his sons to go find her and not to return without her. It was the kind of impossible parental demand that doesn't account for the fact that you can't exactly force a god to return his chosen lover. But Cadmus, dutiful son that he was, set out on this futile quest, accompanied by his mother Telephassa and his brothers Phoenix and Cilix. They scattered across the Mediterranean world, searching for a woman who had been taken by the king of the gods himself, each brother eventually founding cities in the lands where they settled, Phoenix in Phoenicia, Cilix in Cilicia, their names becoming geography itself. But Cadmus continued searching long after his brothers had given up, long after his mother had died during their wandering. Eventually, he found himself at Delphi, standing before the oracle, asking that eternal question, "What should I do?" The oracle's answer was characteristically definitive and somewhat callous. "Give up the search for Europa. Your destiny isn't to rescue your sister. She's beyond your reach now, living as Zeus's consort. Your destiny is to found a city." The oracle told him to follow a cow, specifically, a cow with a half-moon marking on her flank, and to build a city on the spot where the animal finally lay down, exhausted. It was the kind of divine instruction that required faith, because following livestock doesn't typically feel like the path to greatness. But Cadmus, having nowhere else to go and no other purpose to fulfill, accepted this strange quest. King Pelagon of Phocis provided the cow, and Cadmus followed it as it wandered through the Greek countryside. The cow led him northeast, into the region called Boeotia, literally, Cowland, which is either perfectly appropriate or the kind of nominal determinism that makes you wonder if the Greeks were just making all this up as they went along. Finally, in a valley surrounded by mountains, the cow lay down, too exhausted to continue. This was the place. This would be Thebes. Cadmus, understanding that founding a city required divine blessing, decided to sacrifice the cow to Athena. But first, he needed water for the purification rituals. He spotted a spring nearby, the Ismenian spring, its water clear and cold, flowing from the rocks like a gift from the earth itself. Cadmus sent some of his companions, men who had followed him faithfully through years of fruitless searching, who had remained loyal when everyone else had given up, to the spring to fetch water. They never came back. When enough time had passed that Cadmus knew something was wrong, when the silence from the spring became more ominous than mere delay, he went to investigate. What he found was carnage. His companions lay dead around the spring, their bodies torn and broken, blood staining the water and the rocks. And coiled in the shadows near the source of the spring was the reason why. A dragon, massive and terrible, sacred to Ares himself, the god of war. This wasn't some mindless beast. This was a divine guardian, placed at the spring to protect it, to test anyone who dared to draw water from this sacred source. The dragon was enormous, with scales like armor, teeth like daggers, and eyes that burned with intelligence and malice. It had killed Cadmus's companions not out of hunger, but out of territorial fury, defending its domain against intruders. Cadmus looked at the dragon, looked at his dead friends, and felt something shift inside him. He had been wandering for years, following impossible commands from parents and oracles, chasing a sister who was living with a god, following a cow to the middle of nowhere. His companions had stayed with him through all of it, had believed in him when there was no rational reason to believe. And now they were dead, killed by a creature that guarded water that should have been free for anyone to take. The fight that followed wasn't recorded in the kind of blow-by-blow detail that Homer might have given it. What we know is that Cadmus, armed with whatever weapons he carried, faced the dragon alone. The creature was larger, stronger, covered in impenetrable scales. It had the advantage of knowing the terrain, of being a divine creature facing a mortal man. By every reasonable measure, Cadmus should have died there beside the spring, becoming just another corpse for the dragon to guard. But Cadmus was desperate, and desperation makes humans dangerous in ways that divine creatures sometimes don't anticipate. He fought with the fury of someone who had lost too much, who had sacrificed years to impossible quests and now refused to sacrifice anything more. He used the rocks, the trees, the landscape itself as weapons. He dodged the dragon's strikes, learned its patterns, found the vulnerable spots between the scales, and eventually, impossibly, he killed it. The sacred dragon of Ares, guardian of the Ismenian spring, lay dead by Cadmus's hand. Cadmus stood over the dragon's corpse, exhausted, wounded, covered in its blood and his own, and probably wondering if killing a creature sacred to the god of war was going to have consequences. Spoiler, it absolutely was. But before those consequences could manifest, Athena appeared. The goddess of wisdom had been watching, and she had instructions for what came next. She told Cadmus to extract the dragon's teeth, all of them, and to sow them in the ground like seeds. It was an odd command, the kind of agricultural instruction that seemed designed for metaphor rather than practical application. But Cadmus had learned to trust divine commands even when they made no immediate sense. He pulled the teeth from the dragon's skull, each one as long as his finger and sharp as any blade, and he planted them in the soil of this valley where his city would rise. The earth began to move almost immediately. The soil rippled and bulged, and then hands emerged, skeletal hands that fleshed themselves as they rose, pulling bodies up from the ground. Warriors sprouted from where the dragon's teeth had been planted, growing like some nightmare harvest, fully armed with bronze armor and weapons, their eyes vacant of everything except the primal urge to fight. These were the Spartoi, the sown men, warriors born from violence, created from the teeth of a dragon that had itself been a creature of war. They numbered in the dozens, perhaps more, and as they emerged fully from the earth, they turned their attention to Cadmus. He was alone, exhausted from fighting the dragon, and now facing an army of earth-born warriors who existed solely to fight. It should have been his death, the final impossible challenge that would end his story in tragedy. But Cadmus remembered the strategy that would later be used by Jason when he faced his own dragon-tooth warriors. Whether Cadmus invented it, or whether this was simply the logical solution to an impossible problem, he picked up a stone and threw it into the middle of the gathered Spartoi. The stone struck one of the warriors, who immediately turned on his neighbor, assuming he'd been attacked. That warrior struck back. Within seconds, the entire army of Spartoi was fighting itself, unable to determine who was enemy and who was ally, responding to violence with more violence in an endless, self-perpetuating cycle. Number 4. Cadmus stood at the edge of the carnage and watched as the earthborn warriors destroyed each other. Swords clanged against armor. Bodies fell. The ground that had just birthed these fighters drank their blood, completing some terrible circular logic about violence begetting violence. They fought with the single-minded fury of creatures who knew nothing but combat, who had been born for war and would die in war, whose entire existence lasted perhaps minutes from emergence to extinction. Finally, The fighting stopped. The field was littered with the bodies of the Spartoi, and only 5 warriors remained standing. The strongest, the most skilled, the ones who had somehow survived when all their brothers had fallen. These 5 looked at Cadmus, and something changed in their eyes. The mindless fury was gone, replaced by something like consciousness, like recognition. They lowered their weapons and approached him not as enemies, but as followers. Their names were Echion, Eudaeus, Chthonius, Hyperinor, and Pelor, and they became the first citizens of Thebes, the founders of the noblest families of that city. They pledged themselves to Cadmus, helped him build the Cadmea, the citadel that would become the heart of Thebes, and established dynasties that would shape the city for generations. From violence came civilization, from dragons' teeth came noble houses, from death came the foundation of one of Greece's greatest cities. Seek. But there were consequences. Ares, discovering that his sacred dragon had been killed, was furious. You don't kill a god's guardian creature without paying for it, and Ares demanded penance. Cadmus was required to serve Ares as a bondsman for 8 years. 8 years of servitude to the god of war, as punishment for the killing that had made his city possible. It was a strange form of justice, acknowledging both the crime and the necessity, punishing Cadmus while simultaneously allowing his city to be built. At the end of those 8 years, when Cadmus had paid his debt to Ares, the god of war did something unexpected. He gave Cadmus his daughter Harmonia in marriage. Harmonia was the child of Ares and Aphrodite war and love made flesh, and her wedding to Cadmus was attended by all the Olympian gods, one of the few times the divine and mortal realms merged so completely. It should have been a blessing, a happy ending to a story that had involved so much loss and violence. But the marriage brought its own curse. Harmonia received gifts at her wedding, including a necklace and a robe that would bring misfortune to anyone who possessed them. And her children, with Cadmus, Semele, Ino, Agave, Autonoe, and Polydorus, would all face terrible fates. Semele would be destroyed by Zeus's divine glory while pregnant with Dionysus. Ino would be driven mad and leap into the sea with her son. Agave would murder her own son Pentheus in a Dionysian frenzy. The family line that Cadmus established, born from dragon's teeth and divine marriage, would be stained with tragedy for generations. Eventually, Cadmus and Harmonia would leave Thebes, would travel to Illyria, and in the end would be transformed by the gods into serpents. Perhaps a poetic justice for the man who had killed a dragon, perhaps a form of immortality, perhaps simply the recognition that their story had always been about transformation, about violence becoming civilization, about foreign becoming native, about death becoming life. Cadmus was also credited with bringing the alphabet to Greece from Phoenicia, introducing the very letters that would allow his story to be written down and preserved. It's a fitting legacy. The hero who defeated a dragon with violence also defeated ignorance with knowledge, who founded a city with both blood and literacy, who proved that monster slaying could be the first chapter rather than the final one. HC. The dragon of Ares that Cadmus killed wasn't just a guardian of a spring. It represented the old order, the wild and dangerous world that existed before cities, before civilization. By killing it and planting its teeth, Cadmus transformed death into life, violence into society, chaos into order. The Spartoi, who emerged from those teeth warriors born from a monster's remains, became the foundation of Theban nobility, proof that even the most violent origins could produce something lasting and worthy. That's Cadmus's legacy as a monster slayer. He proved that defeating monsters could be more than personal glory, more than completing impossible tasks. It could be the foundation of civilization itself, the violent birth that preceded culture and law, and everything that makes humans more than just clever animals. He showed that sometimes the blood of dragons waters the seeds of cities, that the teeth of defeated monsters can be planted to grow warriors who become citizens, that foreigners can become founders, and violence can become legacy. The dragon he killed guarded a spring, but what Cadmus really conquered was the wilderness itself, carving out a space for human civilization in a world that belonged to monsters and gods. And Thebes, with its 7 gates, its noble houses founded by earthborn warriors, its kings descended from a Phoenician prince who followed a cow and killed a dragon, stood for centuries as proof that the impossible could be made real, that cities could be built on the graves of monsters, that the greatest heroism isn't always about personal glory, but about creating something that lasts. Now, if Cadmus proved that monster slaying could be the foundation of civilization, that violence could be transformed into culture, then Meleager's story offers a darker lesson. Sometimes the monster you defeat is less dangerous than the consequences of victory, and sometimes the greatest threat comes not from the beast itself, but from what happens after you've killed it. Meleager was the hero of what became known as the Caledonian Boar Hunt, an event so legendary that it drew heroes from across Greece to participate, a gathering of monster slayers that rivaled even Jason's assembly of Argonauts. But where Jason's quest ended with betrayal and exile, Meleager's hunt ended with something worse: family murder, divine curse, and a death tied to a piece of burning wood. Meleager was the son of King Oeneus of Calydon, a prosperous kingdom in Anatolia where the land was fertile, the crops abundant, and the gods generally well disposed toward the people. Every year, Oeneus would make sacrifices to the gods, offering the first fruits of the harvest as gratitude for their blessings: grain for Demeter, wine for Dionysus, olive oil for Athena. It was the kind of ritual obligation that kept the divine and mortal realms in balance, that acknowledged humanity's dependence on forces beyond their control. But one year King Oeneus made a catastrophic mistake. He forgot to sacrifice to Artemis. Perhaps he simply overlooked her in the long list of deities requiring appeasement. Perhaps he thought the goddess of the hunt wasn't as important as the agricultural gods. Perhaps it was simple human error, the kind of oversight that shouldn't carry apocalyptic consequences, but in Greek mythology absolutely does. Whatever the reason, Artemis noticed the omission and she was not pleased. Artemis didn't send plague or famine. Those were too abstract, too impersonal. Instead, she created a monster specifically designed to terrorize Calydon in the most visceral, immediate way possible. She sent a boar, but not just any boar. This was the Caledonian boar, a creature of such enormous size and ferocity that it made the Erymanthian boar that Hercules had captured look modest by comparison. Ancient sources describe it as having tusks, the size of elephant tusks, eyes that burned like fire, breath that scorched the leaves on trees, and a hide so thick that spears bounced off it harmlessly. The boar descended on Calydon's countryside like a natural disaster given teeth and rage. It trampled the vineyards that Oeneus had so carefully cultivated, destroyed the grain fields before harvest, slaughtered livestock and any humans who tried to stop it. The beast would charge through villages, its massive body crushing buildings, its tusks goring anyone too slow to escape. Crops that farmers had tended for months were destroyed in minutes. The fertile land that had made Calydon prosperous became a wasteland littered with bodies, both human and animal. People tried to fight it, of course. Brave men took up spears and bows and went out to kill the monster, but the Caledonian boar wasn't some ordinary wild animal that could be hunted with conventional methods. It was a divine punishment sent by a goddess imbued with supernatural strength and rage. Hunters who confronted it were killed. Warriors who tried to corner it were trampled. The boar seemed unstoppable, and Calydon was slowly being destroyed by a creature that Artemis had created specifically to demonstrate what happened when you forgot to honor the gods. King Oeneus, recognizing both the source of the crisis and his inability to solve it alone, sent out a call across Greece for heroes to come help hunt the boar. He promised that whoever killed the beast would receive its hide as a trophy, a prize of immense value, both as a symbol of heroism and as tangible proof that someone had defeated a monster sent by the gods. The call was answered by the greatest heroes of that generation, warriors whose names we've already encountered in other contexts. Theseus came from Athens, the man who had killed the Minotaur and navigated the Labyrinth. Jason arrived from Iolcus, fresh from his quest for the Golden Fleece. The twins Castor and Pollux sailed from Sparta, divine warriors known for their strength and skill. Peleus came, who would later father Achilles. Admetus arrived from Pherae. Pirithous, king of the Lapiths, joined the hunt. Amphiaraus the seer came from Argos. Even Atalanta, the legendary huntress who had been abandoned as an infant and raised by bears, answered the call. It was an unprecedented gathering of heroic talent, a roster of monster slayers assembled for a single purpose. If you wanted to create a dream team for killing an unkillable boar, this would be it. And leading them all was Meleager himself, the Prince of Calydon, the son of the king whose mistake had caused this crisis in the first place. But before the hunt could begin, there was controversy. Several of the heroes, particularly Meleager's uncles, the sons of Theseus, objected strenuously to Atalanta's participation. She was a woman, and hunting was men's work, they argued, conveniently ignoring the fact that the goddess of the hunt herself was female. That Artemis, the very deity whose anger had sent this boar, was a woman who spent her time in the wilderness killing things with her bow. The cognitive dissonance was spectacular, but misogyny rarely concerns itself with logical consistency. Meleager, however, had other ideas. When he saw Atalanta fierce, capable, carrying her bow with the confidence of someone who had never needed male protection, he fell immediately, catastrophically in love. The sources vary on whether this was Cupid's arrow or simple attraction, but the result was the same. Meleager became obsessed with her, determined to prove his worth to this woman who had no interest in marriage or romance, who had dedicated herself to Artemis and the wilderness. He overruled his uncle's objections and insisted that Atalanta be allowed to hunt. Some accounts suggest the other heroes threatened to withdraw if she couldn't participate, which says something about how respected she was among her peers. Oeneus hosted 9 days of feasting before the hunt, celebrations designed to honor the heroes and pray for success. Then the hunters gathered their weapons, organized their strategy, and set out to find the boar that had been terrorizing their land for months. The hunt itself was chaos and violence compressed into a few terrible hours. The hunters tracked the boar to its lair and attempted to surround it, using nets and fire and their sheer numbers to trap it. But the Caledonian boar, confronted by the greatest heroes of Greece, responded with fury that matched its divine origins. It charged into the group of hunters, and several men died immediately, gored by those massive tusks, trampled beneath hooves that could crush bone, killed before they even had a chance to use their weapons. The survivors regrouped and attacked from multiple angles, trying to overwhelm the beast through coordination. Spears were thrown and mostly bounced off the creature's thick hide. Arrows were fired and embedded themselves harmlessly in skin that seemed almost impenetrable. The boar's breath scorched those who came too close, its tusks slashed through armor like cloth. Men who had faced monsters before, who had survived impossible challenges, found themselves genuinely terrified by this creature that seemed unstoppable. And then Atalanta, who had been watching and waiting for the right moment, drew her bow and fired. Her arrow flew true, striking the boar behind its shoulder, penetrating where other weapons had failed, drawing first blood from a creature that had seemed invulnerable. It wasn't a killing blow, but it wounded the beast, enraged it further, and proved that it could be hurt. The boar, now bleeding and even more furious, charged directly at the hunters. And Meleager, seeing his opportunity to impress Atalanta and to save his kingdom, stepped forward with his hunting spear. He waited until the boar was almost upon him, until he could see the fire in its eyes and smell its scorched earth breath, and then he drove his spear deep into the creature's side, angling it upward toward the heart. The Caledonian boar, sent by Artemis to punish King Oeneus, died with Meleager's spear buried in its chest. The creature that had terrorized an entire kingdom, that had killed dozens of brave warriors, that had withstood the attacks of Greece's greatest heroes, finally fell. The hunt was over. The monster was dead. And that's when everything went catastrophically wrong. According to tradition, the hide of the boar belonged to whoever killed it. Meleager had delivered the killing blow, which meant the trophy was his by right. But Meleager, consumed with love for Atalanta and wanting to honor her contribution, announced that he was giving the hide to her instead. She had drawn first blood, he argued. She had wounded the beast when no one else could. She deserved the trophy. It was a generous gesture, romantic even. It was also politically and socially explosive. Meleager's uncles, the sons of Theseus, the same men who had objected to Atalanta's participation in the first place, were outraged. A woman couldn't receive such a prize, they insisted. It was improper, unprecedented, an insult to every male hero who had risked his life in the hunt. When Atalanta moved to claim the hide, Meleager's uncles physically blocked her, trying to take the trophy for themselves. Meleager, seeing the woman he loved being denied what he promised her, seeing his uncles disrespecting both his decision and Atalanta's contribution, lost control. There was an argument, then a scuffle, and then, in a moment of rage that would define and destroy the rest of his life, Meleager killed his uncles. Some sources say he killed 2 of them, others say more, but the number matters less than the fact. Meleager murdered his mother's brothers over a boar hide and a woman who didn't love him back. But when the news reached Meleager's mother Althea, she was confronted with an impossible emotional equation. Her brothers were dead, killed by her own son. The grief and rage were overwhelming, the kind of pain that demands action even when action is self-destructive. Number 1. But Althea had something that most grieving mothers don't have, a supernatural connection to her son's lifespan. When Meleager was born, the fates had appeared to Althea and told her that her son would live until a specific piece of wood, a log that was burning in the hearth at that moment, was completely consumed by fire. Althea had immediately snatched the log from the flames, extinguished it, and hidden it away, preserving it carefully to ensure her son's long life. As long as that log remained intact, Meleager would live. If it burned, he would die. Althea, mad with grief over her brother's deaths, went to where she had hidden the log. She held it in her hands, this piece of wood that represented her son's entire lifespan, and she made a choice. She threw it into the fire. The log began to burn, and as it burned, Meleager, wherever he was, whatever he was doing, began to die. There was no wound, no injury, just a sudden weakening, a heat spreading through his body as if he were burning from the inside. He collapsed, unable to explain what was happening, unable to fight an enemy he couldn't see. The greatest heroes of Greece could only watch as Meleager writhed in agony, consumed by invisible flames. When the log was completely consumed, when the last ember faded to ash, Meleager died. He had defeated the Caledonian boar, had led the greatest hunt in Greek mythology, had gathered heroes from across the world to kill a monster sent by an angry goddess. And he died not from the boar's tusks or any enemy's weapon, but because his mother burned a piece of wood in revenge for brothers he'd killed in a moment of rage. Althea, realizing what she'd done in her grief, took her own life. Atalanta kept the hide and moved on with her life, eventually facing her own tragic story. The heroes who had survived the hunt dispersed, carrying tales of the Caledonian boar, but also of the terrible aftermath, of the family violence that had followed the monster's death. Meleager's story is a tragedy in the purest sense, a tale of heroism undermined by human weakness, of victory that cost more than the battle itself, of fate that couldn't be avoided no matter how carefully you tried to preserve life. He proved that you could gather the greatest heroes of an age, could defeat a monster sent by the gods themselves, could lead the most legendary hunt in mythology, and still die because of family politics and a mother's grief. The Caledonian boar was defeated through collective effort, through the combined strength and skill of dozens of heroes. It wasn't one man strangling a beast like Hercules, or one clever solution like Odysseus, or divine assistance like Perseus. It was a community of monster slayers working together, and even then the victory was Pyrrhic, purchased with blood that should never have been spilled. That's Meleager's legacy, the hero who proved that sometimes killing the monster is the easy part, and that the real tragedy begins after the victory, when human emotions and divine curses collide to destroy everything the hero fought to protect. His life was literally tied to a piece of wood, and when that wood burned, so did any hope that heroism alone could protect you from the consequences of your choices. So here we are, dreamers, at the end of our journey through the blood and glory of Greece's greatest monster slayers. We've walked alongside heroes who strangled lions with their bare hands, who outwitted creatures whose gaze turned men to stone, who sailed past singing death and through impossible straits, who answered riddles that had killed everyone else, who planted dragon's teeth and watched warriors spring from the earth. We've seen strength and cunning, divine favor and human ingenuity, victory and tragedy, triumph and terrible cost. And if there's one thing that becomes clear when you lay all these stories side by side, when you examine the catalogue of heroes who walked into darkness and emerged or didn't, it's this: there was no single way to be a monster slayer. There was no template that guaranteed success, no formula that worked every time. Each hero faced their challenges with different tools, different approaches, different costs. Hercules proved that strength could overcome almost anything if you had enough of it, if you were willing to endure, if you could accept that some victories required you to literally hold up the sky or descend into the land of the dead. His 12 labors weren't just about killing monsters. They were about endurance, about continuing when continuation seemed impossible, about atoning for crimes so terrible that only the impossible could balance the scales. Perseus showed us that cleverness and divine assistance could defeat creatures that seemed invincible, that looking at a problem from a different angle, literally in his case using a mirrored shield to see Medusa's reflection, could turn an impossible challenge into a solvable puzzle. He was the template, the original, the hero who established patterns that everyone after him would recognize and follow. Odysseus demonstrated that the mind could be mightier than the sword, that sometimes survival was more important than victory, that accepting your own weaknesses and planning around them was a form of strength that matched any physical prowess. He proved that not every monster could be defeated, and that sometimes the heroism lay in making impossible choices and living with the consequences. Oedipus revealed that intelligence alone could be a weapon against monsters whose power resided in language and riddles. But he also proved the bitter truth that you could be brilliant and still be blind, that solving the Sphinx's riddle didn't mean you could see the truth of your own life. His victory saved Thebes but couldn't save him from fate. Jason showed us that love and alliance could be weapons as powerful as any sword, but also that victories won through others' sacrifices carry debts that eventually come due. He defeated monsters not through his own heroism, but through Medea's magic and her willingness to betray everything she knew. It was a collaborative victory that ended in tragedy for everyone involved. Cadmus proved that monster slaying could be more than personal glory, that defeating the dragon of Ares could be the violent birth that preceded civilization, that the teeth of a defeated monster could be planted to grow warriors who would become the noble houses of one of Greece's greatest cities. His story was about transformation, death becoming life, violence becoming culture, foreigner becoming founder. And Meleager taught us perhaps the darkest lesson of all, that sometimes killing the monster is the easy part, that the real tragedy begins after the victory, when human emotions and divine curses collide to destroy everything the hero fought to protect. The Caledonian boar was defeated through collective effort, but the aftermath killed more people than the beast itself ever did. Each hero's approach was valid. Each strategy worked for the monsters they faced. Hercules couldn't have used Odysseus's cunning to strangle the Nemean Lion. Perseus couldn't have used Hercules' strength to defeat Medusa. Looking at her directly would have turned him to stone. Oedipus couldn't have fought the Sphinx with a sword. Jason couldn't have obtained the Golden Fleece without Medea's magic. The monsters were different, so the heroes had to be different too. But there are patterns here, threads that run through all these stories. Almost every hero had some form of assistance, divine gifts, clever allies, magical tools, or simply the wisdom of those who had faced similar challenges before. The lone hero, facing impossible odds with nothing but his own strength and courage, is romantic but rarely accurate. Even Hercules, the strongest man who ever lived, needed Iolaus's help with the Hydra, needed Athena's guidance for several labors, needed Atlas's cooperation to obtain the golden apples. There's also the recurring theme of cost. Almost none of these heroes emerged from their monster-slaying adventures unscathed, either physically or psychologically or morally. Perseus inadvertently fulfilled the prophecy he'd spent his life trying to escape. Odysseus lost every single one of his companions. Oedipus's intellectual victory became the foundation of his tragedy. Jason's success destroyed the woman who made it possible and eventually destroyed him too. Cadmus transformed into a serpent. Meleager died because his mother burned a log. Even Hercules, after completing his 12 labors, would eventually die from poison. Specifically, from the blood of the Hydra that he'd collected during his second labor, coming full circle to be killed by a monster he'd already defeated. The monsters themselves tell us something important about what the ancient Greeks feared and valued. These weren't just random creatures. They were divine punishments, cosmic mistakes, guardians of forbidden knowledge, personifications of natural forces. The Minotaur represented the cost of divine anger and human pride. The Hydra embodied problems that multiply when attacked directly. Medusa was a victim transformed into a weapon. The Sphinx was knowledge weaponized. The Caledonian boar was what happened when you forgot to honor the gods. Each monster meant something, represented something, taught something about the world and humanity's place in it. And the fact that heroes could defeat these creatures, could strangle divine lions, could answer impossible riddles, could navigate past singing death, could plant dragon's teeth and survive the harvest, said something profound about human potential. Yes, these heroes usually had divine blood or divine assistance, but they also had courage, intelligence, determination, and the willingness to face things that would destroy ordinary people. They walked into darkness not knowing if they would emerge, and they did it anyway. That's ultimately what made them heroes. Not the victories themselves, but the choice to face the impossible. Not the monsters they killed, but their refusal to let those monsters continue terrorizing the innocent. Not their strength or cunning or divine parentage, but their decision to act when action seemed futile. The greatest monster slayers of Greek mythology weren't perfect. They made terrible mistakes, killed when they shouldn't have, let pride or anger or love cloud their judgment. They were human, even the ones with divine blood, and they failed as often as they succeeded. But they tried. They gathered their weapons, accepted impossible quests, followed cows to unknown destinations, volunteered to enter labyrinths, descended into the underworld, and faced creatures that existed to prove that some things couldn't be defeated. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they won. These stories have survived for thousands of years because they speak to something fundamental about the human experience. We all face monsters, whether they're literal or metaphorical. We all encounter challenges that seem impossible, problems that multiply when we try to solve them, riddles that have no clear answer. choices between terrible options. And we look to these ancient heroes and their monster-slaying legends for guidance, for inspiration, for the reassurance that even the most impossible challenges can sometimes be overcome if you're brave enough, clever enough, or lucky enough to find the right approach. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, wherever you are in the world, whatever time zone you're tuning in from, remember this: the monsters the Greek heroes faced were designed to be unbeatable. The Nemean lion's hide couldn't be pierced. The Hydra grew 2 heads for every one cut off. Medusa turned people to stone with a glance. The Sphinx had killed everyone who'd tried to answer her riddle. The sirens had drowned everyone who'd heard their song. Each monster represented the impossible made flesh. And yet, heroes found ways. Not perfect ways, not without cost, not without sacrifice, but they found ways nonetheless. They adapted, they thought creatively, they accepted help, they endured, they refused to quit even when quitting made perfect sense. That's the legacy of the greatest monster slayers of Greek mythology. Not a simple lesson about strength or courage or intelligence, but a complex, messy human truth that impossible things sometimes become possible when someone refuses to accept that they're impossible, that monsters can be defeated even when defeating them costs everything, that the real heroism often lies not in the victory itself, but in the decision to try. Sleep well, dreamers. May your own monsters, whatever form they take, prove just as defeatable as the ones we've explored tonight. And may you find, when you need it most, the same courage that drove these ancient heroes to step into the darkness with nothing but hope and determination, and the stubborn refusal to let the impossible remain so. The monsters are always there, waiting. But so, it turns out, are the heroes who will face them.